A former overworked Japanese office worker who spent his days exhausted on crowded commuter trains suddenly wakes up and realizes he has been reincarnated into a new world as a 2-year-old noble boy named Van Nefertio. He quickly meets his personal maid, Till, and amazes her by already knowing his own name and the names of his family members. Later, during a grand family dinner, his father, Marquis Yalpa, sternly questions his older brothers about their daily studies. Jard reports that he is learning about fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto states he is studying general magic. When Jelpa asks Van what he plans to do, Van answers that he wants to study the nation's culture and history to better understand the world. Jelpa is highly impressed by Van's maturity at such a young age and laughs heartily. The Marquis explains that he expects great things from Van, noting that the boy will surely inherit powerful fire magic just like him and his late mother. Van soon learns that in this world, magical aptitude heavily dictates a person's worth and social standing. Nobles highly value the 4 elemental magics, which are fire, water, wind, and earth, because of their offensive capabilities in protecting the land from monsters. Anyone born with an aptitude outside of these 4 elements is considered a complete disgrace to their noble bloodline. Determined to understand his new environment completely, Van spends his time in the manor's massive library. He asks Till about the world's geography, noting that ships can only sail from specific ports because massive monsters destroy everything in the deep ocean. He also asks about the various races inhabiting the world, learning about elves and dwarves. Till tries to explain things simply, but Van easily grasps the complex concepts, leaving the maids completely stunned by his prodigy-level intellect. He then asks about magic tools, and Till explains that certain gemstones, rocks, and ores can store magic to create tools based on a person's specific elemental aptitude. At that moment, the strict chief butler, Esparta, interrupts their conversation. He decides to test Van's basic reading and math skills to see just how smart the 2-year-old really is. Esparta holds up 2 fingers on one hand and 3 on the other, asking Van for the total. When Van answers flawlessly, Esparta declares that he will personally become Van's tutor. This marks the beginning of an absolute nightmare for the young boy. For the next 2 years, Esparta forces Van to study relentlessly from dawn until dusk, pushing him to master reading, writing, and advanced subjects far beyond his age. By the time Van finally turns 4, he gets a chance to step outside and begin practicing swordsmanship. He cheerfully spars with Till in the garden, using wooden practice weapons. Till easily blocks his strikes and playfully knocks him to the ground, claiming her victory. However, another strict mate quickly intervenes and scolds Till for disrespecting a noble, pointing out that striking a lord is usually a serious crime. Till panics and starts crying as the other maids hold her back, but Van steps in to defuse the situation. He gently flicks Till on the forehead and declares the matter officially settled, saving her from any real punishment. Van continues his physical training every day and quickly proves himself to be a prodigy with a sword as well. By the time he is 5, he easily defeats the older soldiers in training during their sparring sessions. His past life experiences as an adult give him a massive advantage in combat awareness, allowing him to easily outmaneuver the simplistic attacks of the other children. After winning a spar, Van kindly helps a defeated boy back to his feet, earning the deep admiration of the trainees who respect him for treating them as equals despite his high noble status. While Van rests on a bench and drinks some water, the deputy commander of the chivalric order, D, approaches him and asks to inspect his hands. D is shocked to find that Van has no calluses and realizes the boy hasn't been doing any rigorous physical conditioning outside of light sparring. When Van explains that his brutal study schedule keeps him busy all day and night, D becomes furious at Esparta for forcing the child to study 3 times harder than a normal student. D loudly declares that Van should pursue the path of the sword instead, and promises to personally instruct him to become the nation's greatest swordsman. Van tries to ask D to go easy on him, but D's promise to be gentle turns out to be a complete lie. D puts Van through an agonizingly brutal training regimen, forcing him to do hundreds of upward swings, mid-sweeps, and thrusts while aggressively shouting instructions at him. When Van finally drops his sword and collapses on a bench in pure exhaustion, D cheerfully tells him to rest in a squatting position instead of sitting down to maximize his leg strength. Despite the hellish combination of Esparta's endless studying and D's brutal physical training, Van genuinely enjoys his new life and appreciates the deep sense of fulfillment he never had as a corporate drone. He vows to enjoy his new life to the fullest. By the time Van turns 6, he is widely recognized across the territory as an unmatched prodigy, but the constant daily grind eventually wears him down. Desperate for a break from his endless lessons, he asks Till if they can go play outside. They head to the city's massive central market accompanied by 2 armored guards, Arb and Law. Van is amazed by the bustling activity and the grand headquarters of the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Suddenly, a commotion catches his attention. An older man brutally drags a heavily bruised boy by a thick rope tied around his wrists. The man loudly announces to the crowd that he is selling his own son into slavery to make money. Van is horrified by the abuse. A merchant named Rosalie steps out of the commerce building and enthusiastically greets Van, recognizing him immediately as the Marquise's famous prodigy son. Van points to the abused boy and asks Rosalie how much he is worth on the market. Rosalie states that since the boy only has an aptitude for thieving magic, he is worth no more than 3 large silver coins. Angered by the extremely low price, the abusive father starts violently kicking and stomping on the helpless boy's head. Van steps forward to stop the man, but the father aggressively shoves him away and tells him to mind his own business. Unwilling to leave the boy to suffer, Van loudly offers to buy him for 5 large silvers. He borrows the money from Till and hands it to the father, who immediately takes the cash and walks away without looking back. Van kneels down on the stone path, uses a small dagger to cut the boy's ropes, and asks for his name. The boy introduces himself as Kamsin. Van tells Kamsin that he is now completely free and can go anywhere he wants. However, Till and the guards quickly point out that the Marquis will never allow a random street child into the manor unless he is officially registered as Van's slave. Van asks Kamsin if he is okay with becoming a slave, and Kamsin eagerly agrees just for the chance to stay by Van's side. Rosalie happily guides them through the slave contract process. She magically binds them together, leaving a black Pegasus crest on Kamsin's hand to symbolize his eternal loyalty to Van. Since it is Van's first time doing business with them, Rosalie waives the expensive contract fee. Van politely thanks her, which deeply touches Rosalie, as she has never been genuinely thanked by a noble before. Later at the manor, Van tries to hide from his brutal sword instructor Dee by ducking into a side room. He bribes Kamsin with a sweet bun to lie for him. Dee approaches Kamsin and asks if Van is inside. Kamsin confidently lies to the commander, but Dee immediately notices the fresh food crumbs around the boy's mouth and calls out his obvious deception. Impressed by Kamsin's physical build and his sheer courage to talk back to a high-ranking military officer, Dee forcefully grabs the boy and declares that he will train Kamsin in Van's place. Van quietly apologizes to his new friend from behind a cracked door as Dee drags Kamsin away to the training grounds. 2 years later, Van finally turns 8, which means it is time for his highly anticipated magical aptitude appraisal. The townspeople eagerly await the results, fully expecting their kind young lord to possess incredible fire magic like his father. However, the appraisal results are a massive disappointment. During a tense family gathering, Marquise Yalpa explodes in a fit of absolute rage. He screams at Van after learning that the boy possesses 0 aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics. Instead, Van only has production magic, which is universally considered the most useless and disgraceful type of magic since it only allows a person to craft mundane items like swords and accessories by visualizing them. Jalpa feels utterly humiliated that his late wife's final child turned out to be such a monumental failure. Blinded by anger, the Marquis draws his sword and prepares to execute Van right then and there to erase the stain on their family's honor. Terrified, Van desperately tries to think of a way out as his father raises the blade. Just before Jalpa swings the sword, Van's eldest brother Mercia steps forward and proposes an alternative solution. He suggests that instead of killing Van, they should banish him to a remote, undeveloped village on the edge of their territory. Mercia explains that the nameless village is utterly worthless, completely lacking in important resources, and constantly threatened by dangerous monsters roaming the nearby mountains. Sending Van there as its lord would practically be a death sentence anyway, but it would symbolically secure the family's hold over the newly acquired land without dirtying their own hands. Jalpa quickly agrees to the strategic plan and orders Van to pack his things and leave immediately. Later, Mercia secretly meets with Van and apologizes for suggesting such a harsh punishment. He admits that he only proposed the banishment to stop their father from killing Van on the spot. Van expresses genuine gratitude to his older brother for saving his life. Deep down, Van is actually thrilled about the banishment. He figures that being a lord of a rural, unimportant town means he will have plenty of free time to live a laid-back, stress-free life away from Esparta's endless studying and Dee's brutal training. Van prepares to leave the city with a small group of hired adventurers, fully expecting a quiet, lonely departure. To his surprise, Till stubbornly refuses to be left behind. She lifts her skirt in a determined curtsy and demands to come along as his personal maid. Suddenly, Esparta also appears, announcing that he has already trained his successor and taken early retirement from his duties just so he can accompany Van and continue tutoring him for entertainment in his old age. To make matters worse, the two guards, Arb and Law, join the group, and Dee forces his way into the expedition to keep putting Van through grueling sword practice. Van realizes his dream of a relaxing country life is already falling apart, but he accepts his loyal companions anyway. As Van rides out in his carriage, he believes his father successfully kept his embarrassing banishment a complete secret. However, he looks out the window and is shocked to see the entire town lined with massive banners and massive crowds of cheering people. Dee proudly reveals that he organized a grand send-off parade because he felt bad that Van was being forced to scurry away in secret. Van frantically tells his companions to take the banners down to avoid angering his father, but Dee pretends to be busy patrolling the area. The townspeople cheer wildly, wishing their beloved young lord a safe journey and begging him to visit soon. Moved by their overwhelming support and genuine affection, Van stops worrying about the humiliation of his exile. He smiles brightly and waves goodbye to the citizens, feeling truly grateful for the fun life he has experienced so far, and he eagerly looks forward to developing his new village using his own power. Inside the moving horse-drawn carriage, Van tests out his production magic by channeling blue and yellow magical energy into a small wooden stick. The energy culminates in a bright flash of light and the stick transforms into a black fountain pen. He tells Till and Kamsin that he wants to start practicing his magic to see how useful it can actually be. Kamsin tells Van that he can easily return to the Marquis's manor if he hates traveling to the remote village, promising that Van's older brother would treat him right and release him from his slave contract. However, Kamsin passionately refuses the offer. He declares that he has already decided to dedicate his entire life to Van. He promises to serve and stay with Van forever no matter what dangers they face. Van blushes and laughs, asking Kamsin if he is proposing to him and joking that Kamsin is being a little too intense with his devotion. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted when Dee rides up to the carriage on his horse. He looks panicked and reports that the village they are heading to is currently under attack. They quickly arrive at the outskirts of the settlement and hide in the nearby forest to assess the situation. A group of rugged bandits is aggressively assaulting the village's tall wooden palisade, firing barrages of arrows over the walls while the armed villagers desperately try to maintain a turtle-like defense from the inside. Van observes the battlefield and estimates that there are around 50 enemy fighters, noting that they look like experienced combat veterans or washed-up mercenaries. Seeing the danger, Dee immediately asks Van for permission to charge into the battle with his knights, confident that a united assault can drive the bandits away. However, Ortho the adventurer steps in and warns that a direct attack is far too dangerous given their small numbers. He reminds Dee that their only hired job is to escort Van safely to the village, and he refuses to accept any quest that risks his comrades' lives. Dee gets angry and argues that this village is Van's first territory, and its people are his first citizens, so as knights, it is their absolute duty to draw their swords and protect them. Ortho remains stubborn, stating that chivalry has nothing to do with hired adventurers like them. Dee then compromises, asking the adventurers to at least stay back and protect Van so they can flee if the battle goes wrong. Ortho agrees to this, but Esparta suddenly speaks up and completely opposes the idea. He warns Dee that if the knights die in the attack, the village will have no future even if they win. Esparta then reveals that he is actually a highly skilled elemental mage and proposes a new tactical plan. He plans to erect a massive defensive wall using his earth magic so the adventurers can safely fire ranged attacks from behind it. Once the enemy's attention is fully focused on the wall, Dee and his knights will charge in from the flank to launch a devastating surprise attack. Van asks Esparta if he plans to stay behind as a decoy. Esparta confirms this, stating that it is a great chance for him to show off his old man's strength and asks to be allowed this one selfish request. Van refuses to let him do it. He tells Esparta that he has contributed too much to their noble house to die in a remote forest. He also tells Dee that the knights cannot be sacrificed either because if Van loses his expert strategist and his best fighter, he will never be able to develop the land and his father will likely execute him for his failure. Instead, Van boldly declares that he will act as the decoy himself. Everyone is completely shocked by his decision. Till panics and shouts that she would rather be the decoy than let Van put himself in danger, and Kamsin immediately agrees with her. Van pulls away and calmly explains that he doesn't want to see anyone precious to him die, including Till and Kamsin, who he believes deserve to truly enjoy their free lives. He orders the group to execute the flanking strategy while he rides the carriage directly into the enemy line to draw their fire. When the knights hesitate, Van confidently reminds Dee that they trained in swordsmanship together every single day, so he is not going to die easily. He adds that even if he does fall in combat, dying to protect his people is the best end a lord could ever ask for, and his demise would only cause trouble for his abusive family anyway. Before the battle begins, Ortho and his adventurer friends talk among themselves. Ortho's friends are surprised that he accepted a job to guard a noble, since nobles usually treat commoners like trash. Ortho admits he only took the job because he wants to keep operating in the local territory. However, they remember how Van politely introduced himself to them earlier at the tavern, complimenting Ortho's strength and treating them all with genuine respect. Pluriel, the green-haired mage, admits that she used to hate nobles, but Van taking the time to memorize their names completely changed her mind. Because of Van's kindness and bravery, the adventurers decide to fully commit to the fight and trust the young boy with their lives. Esparta agrees to amend the strategy and prepares his magic. He steps forward, crouches down, and slams his glowing hands onto the dirt. A massive golden magic circle appears beneath him, and a towering pillar of light shoots into the sky. Instantly, a colossal stone wall and a deep trench erupt from the ground, stretching across the battlefield. The bandits are completely caught off guard by the sudden magical fortification. Ortho's archers use the distraction to rain arrows down on the confused attackers. Panic spreads through the bandit ranks as they realize they are being ambushed from multiple sides. Dee and his heavily armored knights charge out from the forest flank and crash into the enemy forces. Dee swings his massive broadsword with incredible speed, unleashing powerful shockwaves that send multiple bandits flying through the air in sprays of blood. Ortho and his team also join the close quarters fight, easily slicing down the disorganized mercenaries. During the chaos, a large bandit with an axe manages to scale the rocky cliff to ambush Pluriel from behind. He swings his weapon at her, pushing her back into a narrow crevice. Just as the bandit moves in for the kill, Khamsin leaps high into the air with his sword drawn. He flips over the bandit and delivers a lightning-fast strike, cutting the man down instantly. Esparta watches Khamsin's incredible agility from a distance and is deeply impressed by the young boy's combat skills. The battle quickly ends with the bandits completely defeated and tied up on the ground. The defenders suffer 0 casualties. Ortho and his group receive their payment for completing the escort quest. 2 of the adventurers decide to leave for their next job, but Ortho, Pluriel, and another man choose to stay behind. Pluriel explains that she wants to repay Van for saving her life, while Ortho admits he is just really curious to see how the odd young noble will develop the impoverished village. Till runs up to Van and tearfully scolds him for putting himself in danger again, begging him to let her risk her life first next time. Van nervously agrees just to calm her down. With the area secure, Dee praises the group for their splendid victory. Esparta notes that the villagers have gathered near the entrance, so Van decides it is time to make a grand entrance. They walk through the gates and are greeted by a very run-down, impoverished settlement filled with weathered wooden houses and dirt paths. Van introduces himself as the new lord to an elderly man with a long white beard, who introduces himself as Rhonda, the village chief. Rhonda thanks Van for saving them and explains that the village has been attacked several times this year alone. He complains that ever since their land was transferred to the Ferio March, the kingdom's knights stopped patrolling the area, leaving them completely defenseless. A younger villager angrily shouts that nobles only care about taxes and ignore small villages that don't pay much. Van stays calm and agrees that the kingdom's laws are deeply flawed, but since he cannot change the laws, they need to find a practical way to protect the village. He lists 3 possible solutions. They can produce something extremely valuable to force the kingdom to protect them. They can earn enough money to permanently hire mercenaries, or they can simply build up the village's defenses themselves. A young woman points out that all of those ideas are basically impossible for poor farmers. Van smiles and confidently announces that things will change now that he is here, promising to do everything he can to develop the land. The villagers remain highly skeptical of the 8-year-old boy's promises. Seeing their doubt, Esparta and Dee step forward to back Van up. Esparta introduces himself as the former head butler of the Marquis, and Dee announces his title as the deputy commander of the chivalric order. The villagers are instantly awestruck to see such high-ranking officials serving a young child. Van then awkwardly admits that he only has an aptitude for production magic, which is considered useless in combat. The villagers groan and look extremely disappointed. However, Van quickly changes the mood by announcing that he is officially lowering their taxes from 30% of their harvest down to just 10% so they can secure a stable life. The villagers are absolutely stunned by the massive tax cut and start cheering wildly. Getting straight to work, Van asks Esparta if his earth magic walls are permanent. Esparta explains that once his mana fades, the stone turns back into loose dirt. Van decides they need a temporary defense while they build something permanent. He asks Esparta to put up a temporary wall around the village. Esparta uses his magic again, causing a tall stone wall and a massive palisade of sharpened wooden logs to shoot out of the ground, completely enclosing the village. The villagers are mind-blown by the instant construction. Rhonda enthusiastically suggests they also dig moats and build pitfalls to further strengthen their borders, and Van agrees that everyone's cooperation is vital for the village's rebirth. Later, Van goes to a quiet forest clearing with Till and Kamsen to test the true limits of his production magic. He picks up a regular wooden log and focuses his energy. He visualizes the fibers of the wood intertwining and weaving together like tightly plied thread to make them incredibly strong. His hands glow with intense blue magic, and the log transforms into a sleek, glowing, rainbow-colored cube. He explains to the confused Till and Kamsen that he just created a fiber block, comparing it to advanced nanofiber materials. Van quickly mass-produces a massive pile of the glowing cubes. Ortho and the other adventurers walk by and are shocked by the huge stack of blocks. Ortho asks to test one out. He throws a block into the air and strikes it with his sword using enough force to cut through solid stone. The sword bounces right off, and the block hits a tree without a single scratch on it. Everyone is amazed by the material's extreme durability and light weight. Van realizes the blocks will be incredibly useful for building. He also notices that despite constantly using his production magic, his mana reserves haven't drained at all. Production magic is supposed to be exhausting, but Van feels completely fine. Taking advantage of his endless energy, he uses the blocks to craft high-quality weapons for his friends. He makes a beautiful, shining katana with a blue-wrapped hilt and gives it to Kamsen, who is moved to tears by the gift. He then crafts a terrifying, massive double-headed axe with a skull design and hands it to Till. Till is clearly disturbed by the ugly weapon but nervously pretends to love it so she doesn't hurt Van's feelings. Van notices her awkward reaction and decides he will make her a cute accessory later to make up for it. That night, Van sits by the campfire and watches Till and Kamsen sleeping on the hard ground. He knows everyone is sore and exhausted from camping outdoors for so long without a proper bath. He realizes that before he focuses on building more village defenses, he needs to secure basic living conditions for his people. He decides to test if he can build an entire house with his magic. He finds Rhonda and asks if he can build a home in an abandoned dirt square in the middle of the village. Rhonda happily agrees, stating it is the perfect spot for the Lord's mansion. Van walks to the center of the square and places his hand on the dirt. He channels a massive amount of turquoise magic into the ground. He visualizes fine wires drilling deep into the earth to form a sturdy foundation, then imagines 4 thick pillars rising up. He connects the pillars with floors and walls, and finally caps it off with a large roof. Swirling white mist covers the area as the magic takes hold. When the mist clears, everyone gasps in absolute shock. Van has instantly constructed a colossal, multi-story white mansion with a red roof, multiple windows, and a tall clock tower. Till, Kamsen, the knights, the adventurers, and all the villagers stare at the luxurious building with their jaws dropped, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of his power. Van looks at his massive creation, smiles proudly, and casually wonders if he made the house a little bit too big. Looking up at the giant house, Esparta praises Van for his production magic and notes that it is perfectly suited for governing a territory. Van disagrees and thinks offensive magic is still the best for protecting people because it makes the citizens feel much more secure. Till and Kamsen quickly chime in, saying they would much rather live in Van's town than in his father's territory. Esparta agrees with them and explains that the people just want a lord who will improve their daily lives. Dee looks at the massive mansion and admits he still cannot believe Van made a whole house in a flash. The adventurers are completely shocked by Van's huge mana capacity and his ability to construct such a building. Hearing this, Van turns to the group and casually offers to make homes for everyone if they just bring him the lumber. Ortho and his adventurer friends immediately freak out in excitement. They shout that they are going to gather the lumber right away and refuse to lose to the knights in gathering materials. Rhonda, the elderly village chief, steps forward nervously and asks Van if he could also make homes for the rest of the villagers. He explains that their current houses are rotting, the floors are giving out, and they can barely keep the wind and rain outside. Van thinks about it for a second and realizes that repairing all the damaged homes at once will probably exhaust him. However, looking at the incredibly poor state of their shacks, he decides he has to dramatically improve their living conditions. he tells Rhonda that he will build entirely new homes for everyone in the village. The villagers explode with joy and cheer for their dream homes, while Dee enthusiastically volunteers the knights to go fetch the lumber. After gathering the materials, Van uses his magic and sends a bright flash of light over the town. The old, rotting shacks are instantly replaced by a neat row of newly built, sturdy wooden homes with stone bases and chimneys. The villagers look at their new neighborhood in absolute awe. Van explains his grid plan to Dee, showing how he arranged the houses into uniform blocks with large streets running between them to avoid any disparity among the citizens. He promises to upgrade the homes further once they mine more stone. The villagers are incredibly grateful for the wonderful renovation and happily offer Van baskets of fresh vegetables and grain to thank him. Next, Van decides to build a simple public bathhouse right next to his new manor. Pluriel uses her water magic to fill the wooden tub, and Comson heats it up with a charcoal fire. The women decide to bathe first. Till and Pluriel relax in the hot water and talk about how amazing Van is for letting people of their low status enjoy such a luxury. Till excitedly tells Pluriel all about Van's past, bragging that he excelled in his studies and was hailed as a sword prodigy by the time he was only 2 years old. Meanwhile, in the men's bath, Camson admires Dee's impressive muscles and says he is training hard so he can become just as strong to protect Van. Dee laughs and overly enthusiastically suggests they all bond by being naked together, which completely creeps Van out and makes him want to leave the tub immediately. Later that night, Van goes to his new bedroom and happily crawls under the fluffy blue covers of his large bed, relieved to finally sleep indoors after so much traveling. The next morning, Van inspects the deep defensive trench the knights dug around the village. He notes that the trench is great, but they need to fill it with water to turn it into a proper moat, which will also secure drinking and bath water for the settlement. Esparta immediately gets to work by using his earth magic to instantly carve out a massive trench leading toward a nearby river. Dee, Comson, and the other men jump into the trench and start digging the rest of the canal by hand. Van follows behind them, using his production magic to turn the dirt walls of the trench into solid stone so the water will not leak. Dee swings his shovel like a maniac, laughing enthusiastically as he sends massive clumps of dirt flying into the air. He finds the hard manual labor incredibly fun because everyone is working together toward the same goal. Esparta watches the 40-year-old knight dig with endless stamina and calls him scary. The group digs at a crazy pace, and by the next day, they successfully connect the trench to the river. Van orders the gate opened, and a rush of fresh water flows perfectly through the stone canal, quickly filling the village moat. The villagers and the workers cheer loudly as they watch the water flow. Esparta suggests they should also create a large lake behind the village to act as a reservoir during droughts. Van completely agrees and builds the lake. The villagers thank Van profusely because they no longer have to make the long, exhausting trek to the river every single day just to fetch water. Meanwhile, deep in a dark forest far away, a blonde military commander named Panamera rides in a luxurious horse-drawn carriage. Her companion, a silver-haired girl with cat ears named Arte, smiles and praises Panamera for being so dashing. Panamera corrects her, stating she prides herself on being as beautiful as a goddess, and tells Arte to get some rest because they still have a long journey ahead of them to reach the remote village. Back at the settlement, Van continues to upgrade the village defenses. He mixes stone into the earthen walls to make them as sturdy as concrete, turning the small village into a miniature fortress city. To make it even safer, he constructs several large ballistæ equipped with protective metal shields and mounts them along the high walls. Dee looks at the massive fortifications and remarks that mere bandits will never be able to conquer the town now. He states that if Marquis Jalpa had known about Van's true power, he would have made Van the heir or at least a development advisor. Esparta points out that Jalpa only cares about combat ability, but Dee fiercely argues that Van's power is the best and that war is about more than just soldiers clashing. Van calmly tells them to stop lamenting their circumstances and says they just have to fight with the resources they currently have. Dee agrees loudly and promises that Van will eventually make a massive comeback. Later, the group sits down for dinner in Van's new mansion. Till serves a delicious meal but apologizes, explaining that they are completely out of seasonings and ingredients to make Van's favorite sweet desserts. Van is absolutely devastated to hear he cannot have sweets. He immediately decides they need to create a unique local industry so they can sell products to visiting merchants and earn money for supplies. Till suggests selling the magic wood blocks, but Van rejects the idea because only he can make them. Someone else suggests selling monster parts, but Van rejects that too since only Ortho's small adventurer group can hunt them safely. Esparta notes it will be a huge challenge to find something completely unique to their village. The next day, Van talks to Till and Kamzin in the forest. He notices they are not practicing with the custom weapons he made for them. They admit they are too scared of breaking the precious gifts. Van warns them that if they do not know how to use their weapons, they will not be able to defend themselves when it matters. Ortho steps in and confidently holds up his prized round shield, bragging that it is made from the hide of an orc knight and is incredibly sturdy. He tells Kamzin to strike the shield with his wooden training sword. Kamzin swings his wooden sword, and to everyone's absolute shock, the wooden blade easily slices Ortho's prized shield cleanly in half. Ortho falls to his knees and cries hysterically over his ruined gear. Van quickly steps forward and uses his magic to instantly fuse the broken pieces back together, making the shield as good as new. Ortho cheers in relief. Just then, Ortho's adventurer friends return with a wagon full of rare ores they gathered from the nearby forest at the foot of the Wolfsburg Mountains. They show off piles of iron, copper, silver, gold, and even glowing blue mithril crystals. Van is amazed they found mithril just sitting in the forest. Ortho guesses the area is rich in resources because no one ever explores it due to the strong monsters. Van asks to use some of the iron ore and uses his magic to compress it into a glowing block of pure metal. Ortho immediately begs Van to forge him a sword from the new material. Van happily agrees and magically shapes the metal into a beautiful, ornate short sword and a heavy longsword. Ortho and the other adventurers are blown away by the quality and immediately start begging Van to make custom weapons for all of them. Pluriel inspects the silver blades and tells Van he could sell these weapons for a massive profit. Esparta approaches Van and examines the blue mithril crystals. He explains that finding such rare metallic ores in a forest usually means there is an undiscovered dungeon nearby. Van realizes that finding a new dungeon would make the village incredibly important and rich. However, Esparta warns him that if they report a dungeon right now, hordes of adventurers, merchants, and the kingdom's chivalric order will flood the village, and they currently lack the infrastructure to support them. Pluriel also warns that the neighboring Ferdinando County might attack them to steal the dungeon's profits. Worse, Van realizes that if his abusive family learns his exiled land has a valuable dungeon, they will likely step in and replace him. To secure his position and protect the town, Van decides they must rapidly grow the village and produce solid results before officially discovering the dungeon. The adventurers agree to keep the area a secret and avoid the dungeon's likely location for now. Later that day, Van and Till walk through the newly built fortress town. Van mentions that he is starting to get tired from using his magic all day, but he is satisfied with the housing renovations. Suddenly, a panicked villager on the wall shouts that a massive dust cloud is approaching from the main road. A huge pack of armored lizards with glowing red eyes is charging straight toward the village. The monsters kick up dirt as they race toward the walls. Van immediately orders the villagers to run inside and commands the guards to raise the drawbridge and secure the gates. The heavy wooden gates slam shut just as the lizards begin aggressively ramming against the outer walls. Inside the fortress, the village men peer through the narrow slits in the wooden defenses and begin to sweat in absolute terror. Seeing their immense fear, Van steps out in front of the gathered crowd in his formal uniform. He tells the terrified villagers that he knows they are afraid of the battle and the risk of injury. However, he firmly states that the lives of everyone in the village depend on winning this fight. Van places his hand over his heart and vows that he will personally fight on the front lines for everyone. He admits that he cannot protect the entire settlement with his strength alone. He looks at the crowd with intense determination and asks the villagers to lend him their strength so they can all protect their home together. Hearing Van's determined plea, the terrified villagers immediately find their courage and agree to fight alongside him to protect their home. Van orders everyone to man the ramparts as they rush up the stone stairs to face the incoming horde of armored lizards. Since Ortho's adventurer party is currently out hunting, the defense falls entirely to the villagers and the knights. Van decides to stay below with Till to issue commands while sending D up to the wall to act as his eyes. D surveys the battlefield and nervously reports that there are roughly 40 armored lizards charging at them, each standing an intimidating 8 meters tall. He is deeply worried because a group of these monsters is usually enough to flatten a village, and even veteran knights struggle to take down just one. Despite the grim odds, D decides to put his absolute faith in Van's leadership and orders the men to load the ballistae with the special iron bolts Van created. When they fire, the heavy metal projectiles easily pierce the lizard's steel-like scales, instantly killing the first wave of 10 monsters. D is completely stunned by the sheer destructive power of Van's weapons, noting that the bolts went right through the beasts. However, the celebration is cut short when they realize they only have one iron bolt left for each ballista and there are still plenty of lizards left. They fire the remaining iron bolts to take down the second wave, completely exhausting their supply of metal ammunition. As the third wave of giant green lizards charges through the thick dust, the men start to panic, knowing that regular weapons are completely useless against the monster's incredibly tough hides. Van quickly thinks of a solution and shouts up to D, ordering him to load the ballistae with wooden bolts instead. The knights are highly skeptical that mere wood can do any damage to armored lizards, but D trusts Van unconditionally and orders the men to fire. To everyone's shock, the wooden projectiles perfectly strike the lizards right in their heads, stopping the massive creatures dead in their tracks. The village forces continue raining down wooden bolts from behind their metal-plated ballista shields until the entire horde is wiped out. They achieve a flawless victory without suffering a single casualty or injury, and they even manage to use very few bolts in the process. The villagers erupt into loud cheers for Van, while D enthusiastically declares that lizard kebab is on the menu for tonight. After the battle, the villagers immediately get to work harvesting the massive pile of lizard meat, white bones, and green scales. Usually, a haul this large would rot before they could finish butchering it, but thanks to the exceptionally sharp custom knives Van made for them, they process the monsters in record time. That night, Van throws a massive festival for the entire village, serving up mountains of high-quality marbled lizard meat. Everyone drinks alcohol, eats skewers, and celebrates their survival and newfound prosperity. During the party, Ortho, Pluriel, and the other adventurers praise the custom weapons Van forged for them. Ortho brags that his sword is light, thin, and slices right through monster bones with zero resistance. Hearing this, D and the other armored knights eagerly crowd around Van, begging to buy their own custom longswords and greatswords. Van feels overwhelmed, but promises to make them all new gear once the village's materials and finances are properly sorted out. Later, Van sits down with Esparta, Ortho, and Pluriel by the campfire to calculate their profits from the hunt. Ortho estimates that an armored lizard normally sells for 20 gold, but factoring in meat spoilage and transport fees, they are looking at about 8 gold each. With 40 lizards, that totals over 300 gold coins, which Van realizes is equivalent to over 300 million yen. However, Esparta quickly points out a major problem with their sudden wealth. According to the duchy's tax laws, any town or village that makes over 100 gold must pay 50% of it in taxes to the ruling marquis, who happens to be Van's abusive father. Van panics, knowing that if his father discovers the remote village is actually highly profitable, he will definitely seize the money and exile Van to an even worse location, completely ruining his dream of living a nice, easy life. Esparta suggests a clever loophole to keep the marquis off their backs. They decide to credit the entire monster hunt to Van's older brother Mercia, who desperately wants to build a name for himself. By giving Mercia all the glory, the brother gets his achievement, and Van successfully hides the village's rapid development from their father. The next day, 2 traveling merchants named Bert and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce arrive at the village gates in their horse-drawn wagon. They are absolutely shocked to find a massive white fortress where a run-down village is supposed to be, and they are even more surprised to meet Van, the famously prodigy son of the Marquis, acting as the local lord. Van welcomes the brothers inside and shows them the towering stacks of green sacks filled with armored lizard materials. Bert and Rango eagerly agree to buy the entire stockpile, though they note it will take them about a month to arrange enough men and transport for such a massive haul. To sweeten the deal, Van gives them a large portion of the meat for free since it won't last that long anyway. In return, the merchants offer to sell Van some of their high-quality weapons. Instead of buying, Van shows them his own magically crafted swords and axes scattered on the grass. The brothers are blown away by the superior craftsmanship and immediately offer to buy Van's weapons to sell on their trade routes. Van quickly realizes that if the merchants start peddling his gear everywhere, everyone will know the weapons came from his village, which will draw too much unwanted attention. To prevent this, he suggests that Bert and Rango set up a permanent shop right there in the village, allowing them to maximize their profits without spreading rumors across the region. The brothers enthusiastically agree to the idea, and Van uses his production magic to instantly construct a beautiful 2-story shop right in front of them, leaving the merchants standing there with their mouths hanging open in pure disbelief. Meanwhile, a luxurious carriage arrives carrying Panamera, a newly promoted viscountess and former knight, along with Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando. Panamera is determined to see for herself if the rumors about Van's genius are actually true. Inside the mansion, Van and Esparta are busy discussing plans to expand their settlement into a massive fortress town capable of housing 10,000 people. Van proposes a unique star-shaped wall design, explaining that attackers will be forced to conquer the pointy outcrops first, and if they go straight for the main wall, they will be attacked from 3 different angles simultaneously. Their planning session is abruptly interrupted when Dee rushes in to announce the arrival of the emissaries from Ferdinando County. Van formally greets Panamera and Arte in his study. Panamera quickly cuts to the chase, noting that Van's land sits right between the county and the kingdom of Yeleneta. She guesses that Count Ferdinando is wary because he thinks Van's father sent him to this border region to build a military outpost and spearhead the Marquis's unseemly ambitions. She also points out that since an 8-year-old prodigy was sent away to the countryside, it clearly means Van has no talent for elemental magic. Van openly confirms his lack of elemental magic and insists that he was simply exiled by his father with no hidden military agenda. Panamera refuses to believe him, arguing that a remote village couldn't possibly transform into a massive stone fortress in such a short time unless the Marquis secretly sent at least 5,000 men to build it. Hearing this ridiculous assumption, Van bursts into uncontrollable laughter. He apologizes and explains that he was practically disowned, bringing only his butler, his maid, and his slave Compson. Esparta chimes in, saying he just tagged along to teach Van as a pastime in his old age. Till adds that Van doesn't discriminate against people of lesser status, so she wants to serve him forever. Dee also steps up, stating he ignored direct orders from the chivalric order to return, choosing instead to stay and follow Van because of his immense potential. To prove his claims about the village's construction, Van takes Panamera and Arte outside to an empty field. With a simple wave of his hand, Van uses his production magic to instantly raise a towering, perfectly smooth earthen wall and a massive wooden gate straight out of the ground. Panamera and Arte watch in absolute awe as Van effortlessly constructs the fortifications right in front of them. Van explains that his father considers production magic to be completely useless, which is the real reason he was thrown away. Realizing the sheer scale of Van's power, Panamera states that the Marquis is an absolute fool for discarding him, noting that his abilities could have drastically expanded the family's influence. She then reveals the true purpose of her visit. She was instructed by Count Ferdinando to offer Arte's hand in marriage to Van as a political peace offering. Panamera admits that she originally planned to sabotage the engagement because she assumed Van's village was a miserable wasteland where Arte would only suffer. However, after seeing Van's incredible abilities, foresight, and the thriving town he built, she completely changes her mind and eagerly pushes for the marriage, even joking that she would marry Van herself if she didn't have such an age gap. Arte becomes extremely flustered by the sudden pressure and doesn't know what to say. Van gently intervenes, stating that they are both too young to rush into marriage and should take their time to think it over. Panamera agrees to stay the night so Arte can process everything. When Arte nervously refuses to sleep in the same building as a man, Van casually uses his magic to build a brand new inn on the spot, leaving Panamera impressed once again by his speed. Later that evening, Van hosts a grand dinner for his guests. Hoping to make Arte feel more comfortable, he asks about her hobbies. Arte shyly reveals that she loves cute things like flowers and dolls. Van immediately asks if she can show him her doll collection the next day. Compson and Till also eagerly chime in, begging to see the dolls too. Seeing their genuine interest, Arte happily agrees, clearly relieved to find people who appreciate her interests. Later that night, as Panamera and Arte prepare to head to their inn, Arte stops to thank Van for his kindness. She admits she was terrified about the arranged marriage, but is now deeply relieved to find out he is such a good person, and she runs off blushing. Back inside the mansion, Van discusses the situation with his group. He realizes that since Count Ferdinando casually offered his youngest daughter as a political pawn with zero leverage, Arte most likely lacks elemental magic as well, and was essentially cast out by her family just like he was. Feeling a strong sense of kinship, Van resolves to let Arte live peacefully in his village, regardless of whether they actually get engaged or not. Back in the newly built inn, Panamera teasingly asks Arte if she has already fallen for Van. Arte quickly denies it with a bright red face, but when Panamera offers to extend their stay for a few more days, Arte immediately agrees. As she lies in bed, Arte smiles happily to herself, deciding to try initiating a conversation with Van the next day and realizing that for the first time in a long while, she is genuinely looking forward to waking up. Early the next morning, Till gently shakes Van awake in his bed to tell him that Dee and Esparta are already hurrying to the large lake he created behind the village the previous day. Van is a bit confused about why they are in such a rush. but Till explains that the villagers have officially named it Lake Van to honor his incredible deeds for generations to come. She also casually mentions that the locals are thinking about naming the entire settlement Van Village, which immediately makes Van panic because he thinks that sounds absolutely terrible and way too embarrassing. He rushes out to the grassy field by the water where a large crowd of villagers is already gathered alongside Dee, Esparta, and Kamsin. Van quickly tells everyone to drop the idea of naming the village after him, but his attention is suddenly drawn to the clear blue water. A dark-skinned mermaid with long blue hair and fin-like ears peers out from the surface, completely surprising Van. Esparta steps up and explains that she is an apkallu, a rare half-human, half-fish species reputed to live in picturesque rivers deep within forests, though he has no idea why several of them have suddenly appeared in the artificial lake. Van decides to take a friendly approach and cups his hands around his mouth to ask the mermaid if she needs something and if she can even understand him. Seeing that she is listening, he figures offering food is the best first step to showing friendship, so he asks Till and Kamsin to bring out some of the leftover grilled meat skewers. The two quickly fetch the food, and Van crouches by the grassy riverbank, holding out a white plate with a juicy piece of meat. The Apkallu girl cautiously swims closer and asks if she can really eat it. Van smiles and nods, watching as she takes a bite right off the skewer while still partially submerged in the water. Her wide gray eyes light up in pure amazement at the delicious flavor, and Van explains that it is armored lizard meat, promising to make her some jerky tomorrow if she wants more. The mermaid suddenly gets very serious and asks who managed to defeat the terrifying armored lizards. Van tries to be humble and starts to downplay his involvement, but Esparta, Dee, and the entire crowd of villagers immediately interrupt him, proudly shouting that Lord Van defeated the monsters all by himself with his incredible strength. Van frantically tries to correct them and says it was a group effort, but the mermaid simply says she understands and dives back under the water. Esparta notes that since her species is so rare, she probably will not return for a very long time, and Van agrees that it makes sense. However, the very next day, Van is shocked to find a massive group of Apkallu men and women submerged up to their chests in the lake. Esparta, Dee, Till, and Kamsin are just as surprised to see the girl from yesterday back so soon, accompanied by several others wearing wing-shaped head accessories and gold jewelry. Van wonders if the Apkallu view the armored lizards as some kind of gods, but Esparta says he has never heard of such a belief. At that moment, a muscular, dark-skinned Apkallu man with a golden crown and a diamond-shaped jewel on his choker steps forward in the water and asks to speak with the young man who defeated the lizards. Van nervously steps up, and the man introduces himself as Lata Vesta, the leader of the tribe, thanking Van for being kind to his only daughter, Lata Priora. Lata Vesta then announces to the shocked crowd that he is giving Van permission to marry his daughter. The entire group of villagers, knights, and even the other Apkallu are completely stunned that the tribal leader is offering his daughter to a young human boy. Van is horrified by the sudden proposal and loudly refuses, pointing out that Lata Priora is still a child and probably has no idea what a marriage even entails. He asks Lata Vesta why he is so eager to offer her up as a bride, and the chief explains that his people usually avoid humans, but recently, the armored lizards have been encroaching on their rivers and killing many of their tribe. Lata Vesta is desperately seeking a strong husband for his daughter to forge an alliance and secure a peaceful place for his people to live. Hearing this, Van immediately tells the chief that the marriage part is entirely unnecessary and that he will gladly protect their tribe from the monsters regardless of any political ties. Lata Vesta is deeply moved by Van's genuine kindness and officially decides that his people will settle in the lake. To make them feel more comfortable, Van immediately uses his production magic to build a massive wooden bathhouse and rest area right on the water, complete with tiered benches and a large indoor pool. The Apkallu absolutely love the spacious and relaxing facility, happily swimming and floating around in the sunlit room. Later, Esparta reminds Van that it is time to deal with the village's sewage system. Van explains to Lata Vesta that he placed sewer pipes underneath all the buildings and they regularly flush water from the moat down the lines to keep everything sanitary and prevent disease. Hearing this, Lata Vesta eagerly offers his tribe's help, noting that they excel at working underwater. Van gratefully accepts, and Kamsin helps open the heavy metal gates, allowing the Apkallu men to dive into the dark waterways and expertly clear out the system using their aquatic skills. Van thanks Lata Vesta for the massive help, and the chief insists it is simply their way of paying him back for letting them live there. Just then, Panamera and Arte walk up to the group, completely amazed to see real Apkallu in person. Lata Vesta notices Panamera and happily refers to Van as his son-in-law, thanking him for the warm welcome. Panamera is completely taken aback and asks Van if he actually married a fish girl. Before Van can explain, Lotta Priora pops up from the water, cheerfully declaring that she is Van's wife and waving goodbye to her husband. Panamera and Arte stare at Van in utter shock while Van hangs his head in pure distress, realizing how bad this looks. To clear the air, Van takes Arte out on a small wooden rowboat onto the serene lake early the next morning, apologizing for waking her up so early. Arte says she doesn't mind at all and enjoys the fresh morning air, admitting that Panamera already explained the entire misunderstanding about the marriage proposal. Van is hugely relieved that things are ironed out, and Arte warmly praises him for building such a beautiful lake and developing the village so effectively. Van humbly credits everyone else for helping him, but their peaceful moment is suddenly interrupted when Lotta Priora surfaces right next to the boat, happily greeting her husband. Arte introduces herself, but Lotta Priora just ignores her and calls Van the Meat Man. Van scolds her for the nickname, but suddenly, a group of other Apkallu kids swim up and playfully grab the edges of the boat. They start rocking it violently, totally ignoring Van's frantic pleas to stop. Before he can bribe them with more meat, the boat tips over, sending both Van and Arte splashing into the deep blue water. The Apkallu laugh at the prank, but Lotta Priora gets a pouty expression and swims away to tattle to her father. Shortly after, Lotta Vesta angrily confronts Van on the grassy shore, accusing him of flirting with another woman while already betrothed to his daughter. Van desperately tries to clarify that they were never engaged in the first place, but Lotta Vesta refuses to listen and challenges Van to a formal 3-round competition. If the Apkallu win, Van must officially recognize the betrothal to Lotta Priora. Van groans in frustration but is forced to accept the challenge. Dee immediately steps up with a confident smirk, vowing to bring Van victory as the deputy commander of the chivalric order. Esparta, Kamsin, and Till also rally behind him, completely confident that their lord cannot possibly lose. Lotta Vesta graciously allows Van to pick the very first event, so Van decides on a game of water volleyball, explaining the simple rules of hitting a ball over a net to score points. He even uses his production magic to create a floating court with a red net and boundary markers, plus comfortable new swimsuits for his team. Panamera steps out in a black bikini, looking incredibly confident, and Arte joins in a cute yellow swimsuit, both eager to help Van win so he doesn't get forced into a marriage. The first match begins with Panamera and Arte facing off against Lotta Vesta and Lotta Priora in the water. Lotta Vesta is incredibly athletic and launches a glowing energy orb disguised as a volleyball right at them, creating a massive splash that nearly knocks the girls over. Van watches from the sidelines in sheer panic, realizing the Apkallu are way too good at aquatic sports and they might actually lose. Arte starts to cry from exhaustion, feeling like it is impossible to beat them, but Panamera refuses to give up and hypes her up to keep fighting. The two girls dig deep and start playing aggressively, diving through the water and sliding on the waves to return every single spike Lotta Vesta throws at them. The match becomes incredibly intense, with both sides trading points back and forth until they reach match point. In a final, desperate play, Panamera jumps high out of the water to block Lotta Vesta's ultimate spike, while Arte gracefully dives through the air to save the ball before it hits the water, sending it flying back over the net for the winning point. Van, Dee, and Kamsin cheer wildly from the shore as Esparta blows a silver whistle to signal the end of the first round. Lotta Vesta is stunned that they lost the volleyball match but quickly announces that the second event will be a 2-person swimming relay. Van panics again because the Apkallu are literally half fish and master swimmers, but Dee and Kamsin confidently volunteer to race for him. The race starts with Kamsin going up against Lotta Priora. The mermaid darts through the water at an unbelievable speed, creating huge white splashes, but Kamsin pushes himself to the absolute limit and manages to keep up right behind her. As they reach the turnaround point, Kamsin tags Dee in. Dee dives from the floating raft and immediately breaks out his signature butterfly stroke. Because of his massive steel-like muscles, the butterfly stroke allows Dee to propel himself through the water with terrifying power and speed, completely shocking Lotta Vesta. Dee surges past the Apkallu chief like a torpedo and touches the finish line first, securing the second victory for Van's team. Dee flexes his muscles triumphantly in the shallows, while the knights cross their swords in a salute to his aquatic dominance. With 2 wins under his belt, Van thinks he is safe, but Lotta Vesta stubbornly insists on finishing the third and final event anyway. He tells Van to pick the game, so Van decides on a shaved ice speed eating contest, figuring the tropical Apkallu will struggle with the cold. Van asks Pluriel to use her magic to create massive blocks of ice, and then he brings out a manual ice shaving machine. He quickly grinds out massive bowls of fluffy shaved ice, covering them in bright red, blue, green, and yellow syrups. For this final round, Vaughn and Arte team up against Lotta Vesta and Lotta Priora, sitting side by side on a wooden bench inside the bathhouse. Esparta blows the whistle, and everyone starts furiously shoveling the freezing ice into their mouths. Almost immediately, Lotta Vesta gets hit with a devastating brain freeze, grabbing his head in agony as imaginary lightning bolts of pain shoot through his skull. Lotta Priora also winces and struggles to swallow the freezing dessert. However, Vaughn and Arte aren't doing much better. Van squeezes his eyes shut, gritting his teeth as the intense cold radiating from the blue syrup completely paralyzes him. Arte forces herself to keep eating the red-shaved ice despite the pain, desperate to win for Van. The rest of the villagers and knights cheer wildly from the sidelines, completely invested in the ridiculous eating contest. Finally, Van and Arte manage to choke down the last of their bowls, securing a flawless 3-0 victory over the Apkallu. Lotta Vesta sighs and officially concedes defeat, shaking hands with Dee. However, the chief smiles warmly and tells Van that seeing his passion and the loyalty of his friends has only made him like Van even more. He happily declares that Van is truly a man worthy of his daughter and tells him to continue taking good care of Lotta Priora before casually swimming away. Van is left completely dumbfounded, realizing the entire competition was essentially pointless since Lotta Vesta still considers him his future son-in-law. Van dramatically clutches his stomach, suffering from an awful ache from eating too much ice, while Till rushes over to comfort him. Panamera laughs and pats Arte on the shoulder, congratulating her on a hard-fought victory. Arte looks around the sunlit room at Van, Dee, Kamsen, and all the smiling villagers, feeling a deep sense of warmth. She quietly wonders how she can get to enjoy a life filled with so many smiling faces and genuinely hopes she can make that happen for herself. Later that day, Arte reflects deeply on her painful past. Since the day she was born, her father was always busy with his duties as a count, so she barely ever saw him. Her mother completely handed her off to a wet nurse and showed absolutely no interest in her because Arte was considered a failure. She was timid, picky, terrible at studying, and lacked any elemental magic. Her only real talent was marionette magic, which allowed her to control dolls and puppets more freely than her own body. Hoping to finally win her mother's love, Arte tried to show off her dancing dolls, but her mother reacted with absolute horror, screaming in despair and calling the magic evil and abhorrent. From that day on, her entire family ignored her completely, treating her like a ghost in her own home until she turned 10, when her father abruptly informed her she was being shipped off to marry the Marquis's exiled son. Arte was terrified of what awaited her, but upon meeting Van, she realized he was incredibly kind and welcoming. She learned that Van was also cast out for having the supposedly useless aptitude for production magic, yet instead of wallowing in misery, he used his unique gifts with absolute confidence and optimism to build a thriving, happy village. Seeing Van's incredible resilience inspires Arte, and she makes a firm resolution to stop hiding and try a little harder with her own magic from now on. The next morning, Van stands on a wooden platform in the center of town, energetically addressing a massive crowd of villagers. He orders them to focus on building more ramparts with an eye toward future development and reminds them to work safely. To motivate the workers, he promises to host a massive barbecue party that night, which sends the entire crowd into a cheering frenzy. Panamera watches from the sidelines, highly amused by his very lax but highly effective leadership style. Shortly after the speech, Arte approaches Van in the dirt field, wearing her favorite white and pink dress. Van greets her and notes that she seems much more energetic than usual. Arte blushes and nervously clasps her hands together, admitting that she feels great today. She shyly asks Van if it would be all right for her to follow him around and watch him work, explaining that she wants to see the world from his perspective and get closer to understanding how he operates. Van gives her a bright, warm smile and happily agrees to let her tag along. Meanwhile, far away from the peaceful village, 3 terrified men sprint frantically across a barren, cracked dirt field. One of them, a man with short ash-blonde hair carrying a massive silver shield on his back, screams out in pure panic for his boss as they desperately flee from an unseen massive threat rapidly approaching from behind. Arte gazes in absolute amazement at the incredibly sturdy, star-shaped stone walls surrounding the village, completely shocked that Van managed to build such massive fortifications in just 2 weeks. Panamera stands beside them and admits that she is also entirely stunned by Van's abilities, confessing that she feels quite envious because it has always been her dream to own her own patch of land. She vows that in her next battle, she will just have to earn enough glory to ask for her own territory. Van then points out the large mechanical ballistae mounted on top of the ramparts, explaining that he designed them so the top and bottom sections can fire separately, allowing them to shoot 2 bolts in a row. He asks Kamsin to test fire one for them, so Kamsin confidently steps up to the massive weapon and pulls the lever. The ballista launches 3 large projectiles high into the clear blue sky, and a few seconds later, they strike the distant green mountains, erupting into a series of massive, devastating explosions. Arte and Panamera watch the destruction in stunned silence, completely blown away by the sheer firepower. Panamera immediately tells Van to name his price because she absolutely wants to buy one of the weapons. Van politely smiles and explains that the ballistae are not for sale, which deeply disappoints her. However, Panamera refuses to give up and asks him to let her have one in exchange for owing him a major favor in the future. Van thinks it over and agrees to the deal, promising to call in that favor later. Panamera is thrilled and starts planning how to transport the heavy machinery with a carriage, but she wonders about the bolts needed to load it. She figures she can just craft her own out of iron, but Kamsin strongly advises her to take at least 1 or 2 of Van's special bolts. Panamera is confused, so Kamsin hands her a strange, black hilt-like object to inspect. Panamera notes that it looks like a sword designed to make heavy work of armored foes, but Kamsin asks if she has a spare weapon she wouldn't mind breaking. Panamera pulls out her reliable silver spare sword, confidently stating that she would be highly impressed if Kamsin could even manage to chip it since it has survived countless battles. Kamsin takes the black hilt, and suddenly, a jagged black blade with a bright white glow extends from it. In a flash of movement, Kamsin swings the magical weapon and effortlessly slices Panamera's thick silver sword cleanly in half with almost no impact. Panamera stares in absolute shock at her shattered blade resting on the ground, realizing the incredible edge of Van's creation. She asks what material the sword is made of, and Van casually replies that it is just ordinary iron, which completely baffles Panamera and her men. Van explains that he uses the exact same crafting method to make his ballista bolts, guaranteeing that a single shot can easily pierce right through 2 or 3 armored lizards at once. Hearing this, Panamera eagerly asks for a supply of the armor-piercing bolts to go with her new ballista, and Van happily agrees to the business deal. Just as they are finalizing the arrangement, they hear terrified shouting from the distance. Ortho and his party of adventurers come sprinting frantically out of the dense forest, screaming for everyone to run for their lives. A colossal, armored green forest dragon bursts through the trees right behind them, towering over the landscape and letting out a terrifying roar. Ortho quickly realizes they cannot outrun the beast, so he yells to his fastest party member to run back to the village and warn everyone while the rest of them stay behind to act as decoys. Van watches from the walls and realizes that Ortho's party is in extreme danger if they try to hold the dragon off alone. He debates fighting back, but worries it might put the entire village at risk. Panamera quickly steps up and offers her assistance, noting that it is only a matter of time before the dragon heads their way anyway. Down on the rocky plains, the adventurers are running desperately when one of them trips and tells the others to leave him behind, but his friend refuses to abandon him. Another adventurer named Kusala decides to sacrifice himself, charging back to draw the dragon's attention so the others can escape. The men are devastated by his sacrifice but keep running toward the fortress. From the ramparts, Van commands everyone to ready the ballistae but strictly orders them to be careful not to hit Ortho's fleeing party. He also instructs Till to immediately escort Arte back to the safety of the village and to summon D and his knights to the front lines. Arte is visibly terrified by the massive monster, but wishes Van good luck before hurrying away with Till. Van knows that flying enemies are incredibly difficult to deal with, so his first priority is to ground the dragon by aiming for its wings. The guards fire a volley from the ballistae, but the massive projectiles completely miss the erratic, flying creature. Seeing that the ballistae are ineffective against the moving target, Panamera takes charge and declares that she is best suited to stop the beast's advance. She stands on top of the stone wall and begins to gather a massive amount of magical energy, causing the sky to turn a reddish hue. Van observes her and realizes that since she was made a Viscountess at such a young age, she must be a top-class elemental mage with devastating power. Panamera unleashes a gigantic, swirling vortex of orange and yellow fire magic, shouting out her fire javelin spell. The intense beam of fire streaks across the sky and slams directly into the flying dragon, resulting in a colossal, blinding explosion that completely engulfs the monster and sends shockwaves rippling across the distant mountains. Everyone watches in awe as the massive fireball dominates the sky, completely convinced the threat is neutralized. However, as the flames begin to clear, Van stares in horror as the dragon's tattered red tail emerges from the molten debris. The beast is heavily wounded but still very much alive, and it lets out a furious roar as it completely emerges from the smoke, revealing its terrifying size and power. Van realizes he heavily underestimated the monster, noting that it is on a completely different level than the armored lizards they fought before. The dragon takes flight again, so Van urgently commands all the ballistae to fire a second volley. This time, the massive metal arrows tear straight through the dragon's teal scaly wings, leaving gaping holes and forcing the creature to crash violently into the stone courtyard below. The beast thrashes wildly against the ground, crushing rocks and kicking up massive clouds of dust. Van quickly orders another volley while it is pinned, but the dragon spots the incoming attack, narrows its glowing yellow eyes, and rapidly glides across the courtyard to dodge the arrows. Van is stunned that the beast managed to read their attack, and the guards begin to panic, realizing how dangerous the situation has become. Panamera quickly steps forward and unleashes another swirling whip of fire from her sword to block a massive orange energy blast fired by the dragon. She successfully shields the group, but the sheer force of the dragon's magic is overwhelming. Panamera realizes her current spells are not strong enough to finish the job, so she tells Van that she needs to fall back to prepare a much more powerful interception spell. She leaps off the fortification and retreats, leaving Van and his men to hold the line. The guards urge everyone to use this chance to flee to the village, but the infuriated dragon suddenly crashes straight through the heavy stone fortress wall, sending massive chunks of debris flying everywhere. Esparta immediately steps in front of the beast, calmly telling Van to run while he sacrifices himself to buy some time. Van is absolutely horrified and screams that he will never run away unless Esparta comes with him. Esparta sighs, noting that Van's stubbornness is troublesome, but agrees to prioritize Van's safety instead. To buy Panamera the time she needs, Van decides to act as bait to draw the dragon into the perfect position. He runs out onto the open, dusty field, shouting to Panamera that he is getting the monster in range. The dragon locks onto Van and chases him across the cracked ground. To keep the beast occupied, Van orders his guards to fire the ballistae directly at his location. Massive metal bolts rain down from the sky, exploding into the dirt just inches away from Van as he frantically sprints to evade both the arrows and the pursuing dragon. Just as the dragon closes in, Dee and his armored knights finally arrive on the battlefield, charging forward with their massive shields ready. The dragon unleashes another devastating blue energy beam directly at the knights, completely engulfing them in a blinding flash of light and flying sparks. However, as the dust settles, Dee and his men are completely unharmed, crouching safely behind the golden magical shields Van had previously crafted for them. Seeing that the dragon is finally distracted and pinned down by the knights, Van signals Panamera to unleash her ultimate attack. Panamera channels all her energy and unleashes her Flare Blast, summoning a gigantic orb of orange and yellow energy that crashes down onto the dragon. The impact triggers a catastrophic, blinding explosion that completely obliterates the surrounding rock formations and fills the entire horizon with a towering mushroom cloud of fire. The red dragon roars in absolute agony as it is consumed by the intense flames. Van seizes the crucial moment and screams for all the ballistae to fire. A relentless barrage of massive arrows rains down through the thick smoke, striking the severely weakened dragon and firmly pinning its body to the dirt ground. The monster is completely trapped under the heavy bolts, barely able to keep its yellow eyes open. Dee calmly walks through the thick black smoke, approaches the pinned beast, and stands right in front of its massive, tooth-filled mouth. With a determined look, he plunges his large sword directly into the dragon's mouth, delivering the final, fatal blow. The dragon's eyes slowly flutter shut as it finally dies, and Dee stands triumphantly on top of its head, resting his bloody sword on his shoulder as he declares their victory. Van watches from a distance, breathes a heavy sigh of relief, and joyfully turns to his men to announce that they have won. The entire crowd of villagers and guards stationed on the walls erupts into wild cheers, celebrating their incredible survival. Shortly after the battle, Panamera and Arte rush over to the shore to check on Van. He assures them that he is completely unharmed thanks to everyone's help. Arte is hugely relieved, and Panamera praises Van for his excellent tactical commands. She points out that they just accomplished an absolute miracle, as a mid-class dragon of that size would normally wipe an entire fortress city off the map, yet their small village suffered absolutely no casualties and only minor damage to the walls. Panamera admits she is stunned that Van's ballistae actually managed to pierce dragon scales, but Van is already muttering to himself about needing to upgrade them so they can fire 10 successive bolts at once, a thought that genuinely terrifies Panamera. Pushing that aside, Panamera announces that they must host a dragon-slaying ceremony to officially grant the title of Dragonslayer to Dee for dealing the decisive blow. Later that day, a massive crowd of cheering villagers gathers in front of the Grand Mansion. Panamera stands on the balcony alongside Van and gives a rousing public address, praising the village for surviving such a catastrophic threat. She formally honors Dee for his bravery and Esparta for his invaluable magic that helped pin the beast down. Finally, she introduces Van as the true hero, praising his unprecedented genius, his brilliant use of production magic, and his outstanding leadership as the lord of the land. The crowd goes wild, enthusiastically chanting Van's name. As Panamera watches the young boy wave happily to his people, she reflects on her own harsh past. She remembers being born into a long line of noble knights, only to be quickly handed off to a different county the moment her magical aptitude was discovered. She endured grueling, agonizing training and sacrificed everything to rise through the ranks, eventually becoming a squad commander at 16 and earning the title of Viscountess solely through her battlefield achievements. She recalls the day Count Ferdinando summoned her to his grand estate and asked her to escort his youngest daughter Arte to marry an exiled lord in a remote land. Panamera had felt deep sympathy for the timid, unwanted Arte, who was completely rejected by her family for lacking offensive magic. Panamera had even promised Arte that she would personally cancel the engagement if the boy turned out to be incompetent. However, after arriving in the village and meeting Van, Panamera realized he was a completely unique and brilliant young man. His endless optimism and kindness not only transformed the barren village into a thriving stronghold, but also inspired the fearful Arte to become confident and proactive. Realizing how incredibly valuable Van is, Panamera turns to him inside the mansion and formally vows to forge an equal alliance with him. She promises that if they ally, she will provide him with full political backing and guarantee that Count Ferdinando's knights will never dare to invade his territory. Van is initially shocked by the offer but quickly realizes it is an absolute win-win situation. With his own father cutting him off and leaving him with no noble connections, this alliance replaces a major enemy with a powerful friend and provides crucial financial support. He gladly accepts Panamera's offer, and the two bow to each other, officially sealing their new partnership and securing a bright, heavily defended future for the village. Following the successful defense against the dragon, Van sits in his office with Esparta to discuss their next big move. He wants to focus on city planning and aims to build a thriving city for 10,000 people. Esparta points out that they need to attract a lot of new residents to make that a reality. Just then, Belle and Rango return from their trip. They bring along two older, wealthy-looking merchants from the Merry Chamber of Commerce to inspect the massive white head and remains of the forest dragon. The older merchants examine the beast and quickly confirm that the materials are authentic and of the highest quality. Van does some quick math in his head. He figures the materials should fetch around 100 platinum coins, which equals roughly 10 billion yen. He gets incredibly excited, thinking he just hit the ultimate jackpot. He asks the merchants for their official appraisal. The older merchants glance at each other and decide to lowball him completely. They quote him a price of only 60 platinum coins. Van is shocked by the terrible offer and knows they are trying to rip him off. Belle and Rango are just as outraged. They instantly protest the unfair appraisal and insist on offering a proper price. The older merchants get furious and pull the brothers aside. They argue that Van has no other options because no other traders will visit this remote village for an entire year. They demand that Belle and Rango play along with the scam. The brothers refuse to compromise their morals. They explain that doing fair business leads to better long-term profits. The older merchants threaten to kick them out of the Merry Chamber of Commerce if they do not comply. Belle and Rango stand their ground, so the bosses fire them on the spot and storm out of the warehouse. Van feels bad that the brothers lost their jobs over him. He casually suggests that they should just found their own trading company. Belle is surprised and explains that starting a firm is actually really difficult. They have to pay a registration fee to the merchant guild and secure their own physical shop. Those two conditions are easy enough, but the third requirement is almost impossible. They need an official endorsement from a titled noble. Van realizes he is just the son of a marquis without his own land rights, so he cannot endorse them himself. He immediately goes to Panamera and asks her to do it. Panamera gladly agrees to support the young merchants. She explains that backing a small trading company will not hurt her at all, and it would actually look bad for the royal family to harass a newly elevated noble like her over it. Panamera then gives Van some intense advice. She tells him that he needs to start taking credit for his actions. She wants him to claim that he defeated the dragon all by himself. Van hates the idea of standing out and drawing attention. Panamera explains that achieving such fame will earn him a noble title. Getting his own title is the only way to prevent his family from dragging him back home and exploiting his success. She casually mentions that earning a title brings enemies, but she deals with them by simply reducing them to ash. Van is absolutely terrified by her ruthless life advice and begs her not to eat him. Panamera laughs and promises she will not eat him for at least another 5 years. Van realizes he has no choice and reluctantly agrees to take the glory for the dragon kill. With Panamera's noble endorsement officially secured, Belle and Rango happily buy the dragon materials from Van for a massive 130 platinum coins. The brothers quickly prepare to transport the valuable goods to the royal capital to sell them. They realize they have a major problem because the older merchants stole all the transport carriages on their way out. The scammers hope that leaving the brothers stranded will force them to come crying back for their jobs. Panamera easily ruins their petty plan. She lends Belle and Rango her elite war horses to pull a brand new carriage that Van quickly builds for them. Meanwhile, the older merchants ride lazily across the dry plains toward the capital. They sit in their carriage and gloat about their trap. Suddenly, Panamera blasts past them on her warhorse at incredible speed. A moment later, Belle and Rango speed right by in their new carriage. The older merchants stare out their window in absolute shock and despair. They realize the young brothers actually managed to secure a noble's cooperation and start their own company. Panamera arrives at the grand audience chamber in the royal capital. She kneels on a long red carpet before King Dino and his royal guards. The king questions why she wants to grant a noble title to someone else instead of asking for a promotion for herself. Panamera formally recommends Van for the honor. The king is highly skeptical that an 8-year-old child from a remote village deserves a title. Panamera confidently lists Van's unbelievable achievements. She explains how the young boy protected his village from a bandit raid using only a few subordinates. She details how he used his unique production magic to instantly build massive walls, a moat, and sturdy homes to fortify the entire settlement. Finally, she reveals that Van and his men flawlessly slew a massive forest dragon without suffering a single casualty. The king and his guards are absolutely stunned by the story. The king finds it hard to believe until a young guard steps forward and presents a massive dragon fang on a wooden stand as physical proof. The king is thoroughly impressed by the evidence and Van's incredible potential. He officially grants Van the title of Baron. Soon after, a herald stands on a wooden platform in the city square and announces the news to the public. The citizens cheer and gossip enthusiastically about the child prodigy who managed to slay a dragon. Back in the village, Van continues his rapid development projects. He upgrades the simple houses into much nicer buildings and constructs a beautiful town square. He also uses his magic to build 2 massive stone watchtowers, naming them Oligo Tower and Grape Tower. These towers serve as symbols for the town and greatly improve their ability to spot incoming enemies. Van invites Esparta, Till, Arte, and Kamsen to the top of one of the towers for a scenic picnic. They sit on a checkered blanket and enjoy the high view of the walled settlement. Van happily eats Till's homemade egg sandwiches. Esparta jokes that Van will probably try to name the expanding settlement something silly like Vantown. Till thinks it sounds lovely, but Van gets embarrassed and immediately shuts the conversation down. Arte then shyly approaches Van. She asks him to drop her formal title and just call her Arte from now on to make things easier. Van agrees without hesitation, and Arte blushes with pure joy. Till then announces it is time for dessert. She brings out a massive, perfectly baked cake. Everyone is amazed by the sweet treat. Till explains that she was finally able to bake it because Belle and Rango's new shop opened in the village and stocked all the right ingredients. The group happily eats the cake, though Till sadly admits she has been eating cake every single day and is now deeply worried about her weight. While they enjoy the view, Kamsin suddenly points toward the horizon. He spots a large group of people approaching the heavy stone gates. Van heads down to the entrance to meet them. The group consists of several dozen exhausted, somber villagers led by an elderly man with a white beard. The elder explains that they traveled all the way from a neighboring village in Count Ferdinando's territory. He tells Van that the Count recently took all their young people away to bolster his military forces for an upcoming war. This left the village with only the elderly, who cannot handle the heavy labor or pay the crushing taxes demanded by the Count. Desperate for survival, they came to Seattle hoping for help. Van feels terrible for their situation. He immediately offers to let all 300 members of their village relocate to his town. He promises to provide them with sturdy houses, plenty of food, and a complete exemption from taxes until they get back on their feet. The refugees are completely stunned by his generosity and weep with relief. Van asks Ortho and Pluriel to take their adventurer party and escort the rest of the refugees safely to the town. Before they leave, the elder mentions that they are bringing their dairy cows with them. Van completely loses his composure and gets incredibly excited. He knows that having cows means he can finally produce cheese and butter, which will become a major new industry for the town. Ortho, Pluriel, and their party guide the massive line of refugees through a dense forest filled with autumn leaves. The journey is long and tiring, but the adventurers keep the weary travelers moving forward. Pluriel yells at Ortho to stay alert so they do not get ambushed by another dragon. Ortho reassures a worried refugee woman that they are heading to a truly amazing place. By nightfall, the massive group finally arrives inside the fortified walls of Kyoto. Van greets the exhausted travelers with a massive outdoor barbecue. He sets up huge metal grills over glowing coals and cooks enormous, thick steaks and vegetable skewers. The refugees stare at the massive pile of food in disbelief. One young boy timidly asks if they are actually allowed to eat it. Van gives them a huge smile and tells everyone to eat their fill. The villagers eagerly grab the food and devour the delicious meat, completely overwhelmed by the warm welcome. After the feast, the village elder and a few others approach Van. They explain that they have absolutely no savings and urgently need work to earn a living. Van is happy to help and quickly assigns them jobs. He asks them to help run the newly opened shops, manage the village inn, and help cultivate the new farmlands. The villagers are worried because they have no experience running businesses. Van assures them it will be fine. He promises to handle all the complicated math so they only have to focus on the manual work. The elder is deeply moved and vows that everyone will work hard to help the town prosper. Just then, Till walks out carrying dozens of fresh strawberry shortcakes. She explains that she used the milk from the refugees' cows to make the whipped cream. The villagers are amazed by the beautiful desserts and thank Van profusely for giving them a second chance at life. They all cheer, finally feeling a sense of hope and excitement for their future. As the celebration continues, Esparta walks up to Van. He praises Van for taking in the refugees, but reminds him that they are still a long way from reaching their goal of 10,000 residents. Van smiles confidently and looks out over his growing town, fully accepting the challenge to keep working hard on his city building. The next day, Van is out in the lush forest trying to finish his daily studies with Esparta. Van complains heavily about having to study right after finishing his physical labor, claiming it is completely unreasonable. Esparta casually brushes off his complaints, stating that he has never heard of anyone dying from simply reading books. Pluriel, Ortho, and Kusala suddenly approach them with guilty expressions and immediately apologize for messing up. Kusala explains that he accidentally discovered the entrance to a new dungeon while scouting the area. Van is incredibly frustrated by this news because he specifically wanted to avoid finding a dungeon. He knows that a dungeon will attract a massive flood of rowdy adventurers to their quiet village, which will inevitably draw unwanted attention from his father, the Marquis, and expose all of Van's secret development projects. Esparta points out that they have no choice in the matter and must send a messenger to the royal capital to report the discovery promptly. Van reluctantly agrees and assigns Kusala to make the trip to the capital since he is the one who found the dungeon in the first place. He tasks Pluriel and Ortho with exploring the surrounding area of the dungeon to gather more information. To make up for sending Kusala on a long solo journey, Van gives him a brand new, incredibly rare mithril shortsword as a reward. Kusala is absolutely thrilled with the shiny weapon and happily rides off on his brown horse toward the capital. During his journey, Kusala spends most of his time admiring the beautiful mithril dagger instead of paying attention to the road. He soon encounters a vicious pack of green-skinned orcs and a massive, fanged stone monster. Normally, these creatures would give him a lot of trouble, but Kusala quickly realizes that the mithril sword makes him incredibly powerful. Large winged beasts swoop down from the sky and snatch up some of the orcs, but Kusala easily slices through the remaining stone monsters with incredible speed and agility. He is amazed by how uncoordinated the monsters seem and easily defeats them all without breaking a sweat. After the fight, Kusala finds an overturned wooden carriage and rescues a young girl named Flamiria. Flamiria thanks him profusely and assumes he is a famous, high-ranking hero based on his incredible combat skills. Kusala gets very embarrassed and blushes, admitting that he is just a humble adventurer. Flamiria explains that she is the daughter of a fallen baron whose lands were conquered, and she is currently walking to the royal capital to find work as a common maid. Kusala immediately offers her a ride on his horse, joking that the horse prefers carrying a pretty girl anyway. He then invites Flamiria to come back to Van's village instead of going to the capital, promising that there is plenty of work available and that he will personally protect her. Flamiria is deeply moved by his kindness and happily accepts his offer. Meanwhile, back in the village, Van and Esparta discuss the inevitable arrival of the adventurers. Esparta suggests that Van should build a completely separate outpost to house the newcomers so they do not ruin the peaceful village. He also advises Van to appoint a governor for the outpost and establish 2 separate chivalric orders to maintain the peace. Van agrees to the plan and decides that Dee's current group will become the CO Chivalric Order, while the new outpost will have the Esparta Chivalric Order. Esparta instantly volunteers to be the governor of the new outpost. Later, Van is out in the sandy fields doing the heavy lifting to construct the new outpost walls. He watches Dee approach a group of workers to recruit them for his Citeaux Chivalric Order. However, the workers awkwardly explain that they have already signed binding contracts to join the Esparta Chivalric Order. Van falls to his knees in despair, completely shocked by how fast and sneaky Esparta was in securing all the best men for himself. Shortly after, Khamsin approaches Van to announce that Kusala has returned from his trip. Van greets Kusala, who proudly introduces Flameria to the group. Flameria praises Kusala as a legendary hero who bravely saved her from a horde of monsters. Kusala nervously tries to downplay his actions, claiming it was all thanks to the mithril sword Van gave him, but Flameria insists he is amazing. Van instantly sees through the situation and realizes Kusala is just showing off to impress a girl. Suddenly, a massive cloud of dust appears on the horizon, signaling the arrival of the first wave of adventurers. The group looks like a band of barbaric, post-apocalyptic thugs covered in spiked silver armor, facial scars, and colorful mohawks. The terrifying men approach Van, Khamsin, Arte, and the others, but surprisingly, they do not attack. Instead, they warn the kids that the area is too dangerous for them and tell them to run back to their village before they get hurt. The thugs think the village is just a tiny, defenseless settlement. Van casually points to the massive, towering stone walls and gatehouse nearby, explaining that they are already at the village. The thugs are completely dumbfounded by the sheer size of the fortifications. Pluriel decides to show off and unleashes a powerful blast of blue magic that obliterates a large wooden log, terrifying the thugs and causing them to scream in agony. The thugs finally realize that they are dealing with Van, the famous child prodigy everyone in the capital is talking about. One of the thugs rudely calls Van a brat, which instantly enrages Dee. Dee steps forward as the official commander of the CO Chivalric Order and demands to know who insulted his lord. The thugs try to attack him with their swords, but Dee effortlessly parries their blows and unleashes a massive wave of energy with his warhammer, knocking them all back. After a thorough beating, the entire group of Mohawk thugs bows respectfully to Dee, absolutely terrified of his strength. However, they still find it highly amusing that their powerful lord is just an 8-year-old boy and casually joke with Van about his noble status. Later, Pluriel and Ortho report back from their scouting mission. Pluriel explains that the dungeon entrance is located deep within a dangerous, craggy crevice several hours away by carriage. Despite the harsh environment, she relentlessly pesters Van to go build a base there. She demands that he build her a comfortable place with desserts and a spot for her to take naps. Van complains that the forest is too dangerous and reminds her that he has a strict curfew, but Pluriel refuses to back down. Knowing he has no choice, Van reluctantly agrees to go the next day and brings Till, Khamsin, and Arte along for the ride. Ortho quickly rounds up the Mohawk thugs to act as their personal guards. The next morning, the group sets off in a luxurious white carriage. The bumpy ride through the mountains takes a toll on Khamsin, who covers his mouth and looks severely nauseous. Van casually reminds Khamsin that he was the one who originally suggested going to the dungeon, which only makes Khamsin feel worse. While Khamsin suffers, Arte and Till happily gaze out the window at the beautiful, lush mountain scenery and spot-flying monsters in the distance. The Mohawk thugs also have a great time, easily slaughtering a giant mossy troll they find along the path. Eventually, the carriage reaches the edge of a massive, deep canyon with a rushing river far below. Van looks out the window and completely panics. He screams for the driver to stop the carriage immediately. He steps out and is horrified to see the green-haired Mohawk thug casually balancing on one leg on a thin, loose wooden log suspended over the deadly drop. Van is furious at their complete lack of common sense and forces the entire group of armored thugs to kneel on the dirt. He gives them a stern lecture on predicting danger and managing risk, pointing out that one tiny mistake will lead to their instant deaths. Kusala asks what would happen if he kicked the log while someone was on it, and Van angrily yells that the person would fall and die. The thugs do not take him seriously and make a terrible pun about treading carefully on trees. Van gets so annoyed that he threatens to cancel the base construction entirely, which finally gets the thugs to apologize in unison. To ensure everyone's safety, Van uses his magic to instantly construct a massive, sturdy stone arch bridge across the chasm. The thugs are amazed and safely cross to the dungeon entrance. Once they arrive at the rocky cave, Van asks the adventurers what kind of facilities they want for their new base. The thugs enthusiastically demand a gambling den, a loud tavern, and an amusement park. Van instantly rejects all of their ridiculous ideas and decides to build something practical. He starts by placing a heavy metal gate over the dungeon entrance to prevent any monsters from escaping into the wild. Then, he uses his production magic to instantly construct a massive, 4-story traditional building with white walls and a blue-tiled roof. He gives the adventurers a grand tour of the facility. The first floor features a spacious rest area and a storehouse for their gear. The second floor contains a massive cafeteria where the thugs immediately plan to hold eating contests. The third floor is a dormitory filled with soft, fluffy beds, prompting the men to cheer about having pillow fights. Van also includes a beautiful wooden terrace that overlooks the entire mountain valley, giving the adventurers a perfect place to relax between their dungeon runs. Finally, he shows them the rooftop water tanks and rain catchers that power the building's indoor flush toilets. He strictly warns the men not to drink the toilet water, though they all look incredibly confused by the instructions. Van leaves the scarred Mohawk man in charge of managing the base and telling everyone to behave. The adventurers lean out of the many windows and cheer enthusiastically, looking like a bunch of spotted eels to Van. As the sun begins to set, casting a bright orange glow over the mountains, Arte reminds everyone that it is getting late. Van realizes his curfew is approaching and panics, stating that Esparta will be incredibly angry if he does not return in time. The thugs just laugh at him, finding it hilarious that a powerful lord is still afraid of a curfew. Before they pack up to leave, Arte notices a massive, multi-pointed, glowing blue crystal sticking out of the rocky cave wall. The group rushes over to inspect it and quickly realizes that it is a massive vein of highly valuable mithril ore. They celebrate their incredible discovery, load up the carriage, and rush back toward the village under the cover of darkness. By the time they finally arrive back at the village streets, it is pitch black outside. Esparta is waiting for them near the carriage, wearing a formal suit and a terrifyingly serene smile with his eyes completely closed. Van senses the overwhelming aura of anger radiating from his tutor and completely panics. Desperate to avoid punishment, Van tries to throw his friends under the bus, claiming the delay was all because he was forced to help the adventurers. He frantically calls out to Till, Kamsin, Arte, and Ortho to back up his story. However, Till gets incredibly nervous and makes an excuse. Kamsin flatly refuses to help. Arte acts shocked and confused, and Ortho aggressively shifts the blame entirely onto Van to save his own skin. Esparta commands everyone to be silent and steps toward the trembling boy. He calmly tells Van that they need to have a very serious talk and gently touches his chin. Esparta then drags a crying and terrified Van away into the dark estate so he can face his inevitable punishment for missing his curfew. The following day, Van takes a walk through the newly finished streets of the village alongside Arte. She is absolutely amazed by how beautiful all the houses and paved roads turned out and mentions that everyone must be thrilled to live in such a wonderful place. Van turns to her and asks what she personally wants to do with her life now, setting aside all the arranged marriage proposals they constantly receive. Arte gets extremely flustered, blushing heavily as she nervously clutches her dress and confesses that she actually wants to get engaged to him. Van is completely taken aback by her sudden confession but quickly breaks into a wide, happy smile. However, since the situation is too embarrassing for both of them, they quickly agree to just pretend the conversation never happened and continue their walk. Shortly after, they meet up with the two merchants, Bert and Rango, who have just returned from their trip to the royal capital. The merchants happily report that they successfully set up Van's new trading company without any issues and hand over a massive pouch containing 30 platinum coins as his share of the profits. Till is absolutely horrified by the sheer amount of money, trembling as she holds the heavy pouch, since she has never handled such ridiculous wealth in her entire life. The merchants also bring news about Panamera, mentioning that instead of returning to her father, she plans to request her own territory right next to Van's village because she finds his projects far more interesting than regular noble duties. On top of the money, Burr and Rango present Van with a special gift they found in the capital, which is a state-of-the-art repeating crossbow made of wood. Van is overjoyed by the weapon and immediately starts brainstorming ways to use its rapid-fire mechanism to build brand new ballistae for the village defenses. Later, Van sits in his study with Arte and Till while trying to use his production magic to replicate the complicated crossbow mechanism out of stone. However, his magic completely fails, leaving the stone block inert. Arte is genuinely shocked to see Van fail at something, which prompts him to humbly admit that aside from his unique production magic, he has absolutely no real talents. Arte vehemently disagrees and praises his incredible skills with a sword and his deep knowledge of studying, but Van simply brushes off her compliments. He then shifts the focus back to her and asks what her specific magical aptitude is, since she has never used it around him. Arte looks down in shame and hesitantly reveals that she possesses marionette magic. She explains that just like his production magic, marionette magic is considered completely useless by the nobility and is heavily looked down upon by society. Instead of judging her, Van gets incredibly excited and begs her to show him how it works, quickly uses his magic to create a small, intricately designed doll for her to practice on. Arte concentrates, and a bright purple magical aura surrounds her hands as she successfully makes the little doll float into the air and perform a delicate routine. Van and Till are completely mesmerized by the beautiful display and praise her incredible control. Till enthusiastically suggests that they put on a massive public show so Arte can entertain all the villagers with her puppets. Arte instantly rejects the idea out of fear, recalling how her own father called her a failure and worrying that the villagers will mock her. Van gently reassures her, pointing out that everyone thought his production magic was garbage too, but he used it to bring happiness and safety to the entire village. He promises her that the villagers will love her performance just as much, which finally gives Arte the courage to agree to the show. That night, a massive crowd of villagers and rowdy adventurers gathers in the center of town under the hazy purple sky, completely clueless about what they are about to watch. Van steps out onto the brightly lit wooden stage and announces that they are about to witness a magical performance by Arte. As soon as the words leave his mouth, nervous whispers spread through the crowd. Some of the villagers murmur that marionette magic is the tool of vile criminals and assassins, notorious for being used in plots to murder the royal family. Backstage, Arte hears all the cruel whispers and completely freezes in terror, terrified of how everyone will treat her after this. Her anxiety causes her to lose control of the life-size puppet on stage, which abruptly stops moving. Seeing her distress, Van quickly steps forward and addresses the restless crowd directly. He boldly defends Arte, stating that while marionette magic is often heavily discriminated against and unfairly labeled as evil, they are about to see its true, beautiful potential. His confident words manage to calm the crowd down. Backstage, Arte is deeply moved by Van's unwavering support. She closes her eyes and remembers all the wonderful, happy memories she has made with Van and the others since arriving at the village. Filled with newfound confidence, she channels her magic again. The life-sized puppet in white armor and a wide-brimmed hat springs back to life on the wooden stage and begins to perform a breathtaking, graceful dance under the bright spotlights. The crowd watches in absolute awe as the puppet spins and glides flawlessly across the floor, completely entranced by the beautiful movements. When the dance finally ends, the entire audience erupts into massive cheers, praising the incredible magic and begging for more. Overcome with relief and joy, Arte bursts into tears and warmly hugs Van, thanking him profusely for believing in her. The peaceful atmosphere is shattered the very next day when a panicked guard runs through the streets, shouting that a royal carriage is approaching the village. Van quickly gathers Arte, Kamsin, Esparta, and Till to meet the visitors at the village entrance. The carriage arrives and Panamera steps out, accompanied by an older blonde man wearing a golden crown and his chancellor. The man introduces himself as Dino Enzola Berlinate, the king of the Scuderia kingdom. The king officially promotes Van to the rank of baron, making him a true noble, and explains that he came personally to inspect the newly discovered dungeon and confirm all the ridiculous rumors about Van's achievements. The king demands complete honesty from Van, warning him that he will not tolerate any lies. Van respectfully agrees but asks the king to keep an open mind, knowing that his magical creations are incredibly hard to believe. Van begins the royal tour by taking the king up to the massive star-shaped stone ramparts overlooking the village. He explains how the moat, the walls, and the heavy ballistae create an impenetrable defense. To demonstrate, Van orders Kamsin to fire one of the newly upgraded ballistae. Kamsin pulls the lever, and the massive weapon launches a devastating energy blast that completely obliterates a large section of the distant forest. The king and the chancellor are absolutely stunned by the sheer destructive power and the weapon's rapid-fire capability. However, the king grows highly suspicious when Van casually claims that he designed the complex star-shaped fortress and built the massive walls himself in just 4 months. The chancellor insists that such a massive development project should take several years and accuses Van of lying. Seeing that words are not enough, Esparta suggests they continue the tour down by the lake so Van can prove his claims with a practical demonstration. As the royal group walks through the paved streets, the common villagers casually wave and say hello to Van, treating him like a close friend. The king and the chancellor are completely bewildered by the lack of formal respect, entirely unused to seeing a lord converse so casually with commoners. Their confusion only deepens when the group of massive, heavily armored adventurers with colorful mohawks runs past them carrying wooden barrels and cheering wildly. Van casually explains that they are just some local adventurers he befriended, leaving the king staring in absolute shock at the bizarre sights of the village. The group finally reaches the lake, where Latavesta, the muscular chieftain of the Apkallu, emerges from the water alongside several mermaids to greet Van. Latavesta loudly refers to Van as his son-in-law, which Van immediately denies, but the king is too busy being mind-blown by the presence of the incredibly rare Apkallu living openly in the village. Latavesta formally introduces himself to the king and offers a gift to prove their friendship. He pulls out a massive, glowing pink crystal and hands it to Van. The chancellor instantly recognizes the crystal as orichalcum, the legendary metal of the gods, and completely loses his mind. He screams that forging a single sword from that chunk of orichalcum would cost over 100 platinum coins and instantly become a priceless national treasure. Ignoring the chancellor's panic, Van casually uses his production magic to instantly mold the raw crystal into a flawless, pink-bladed sword right in front of their eyes. The king and the chancellor are left completely speechless, realizing that everything Van said about building the walls and crafting weapons was entirely true. The king finally stops treating Van like a child and promises to grant him any demand as a reward for his total honesty. Van takes the opportunity to request permanent residency in the village, begging the king never to force him to move to the royal capital. He passionately explains that as a lord, it is his sworn duty to protect his people and create a peaceful land where they never have to struggle for food or shelter. He also secretly admits to himself that he just wants to stay in the village so he can enjoy a lazy, slow life. Deeply impressed by Van's dedication to his subjects, the king agrees to the terms and promises to send an emissary for future business instead of making Van travel. The king then mentions that he cannot stay away from the capital for much longer but wants to inspect the dungeon before he leaves. Van advises against it, explaining that the dungeon is a full-day trip and it is already getting late. Just as they are discussing the schedule, a terrified villager sprints up to the group and screams that there is an emergency. A massive, terrifying gray dragon suddenly appears high in the sky, flying directly toward the village. As panic instantly sweeps through the streets, Van screams at the top of his lungs, ordering all the guards to man the defenses and sending runners to alert the rowdy adventurers for battle. As panic instantly sweeps through the streets, Van screams at the top of his lungs, ordering all the guards to man the defenses and sending runners to alert the rowdy adventurers for battle. Morgana looks up at the sky in shock and quickly points out that the incoming creature is actually a wyvern. King Dino and Chancellor Periphery observe the beast and note that wyverns are naturally pack animals, making it highly unusual for one to attack a village completely alone. Quickly deduce that a mage must be controlling it from afar, which implies that a small group of elite enemy knights from the rival Yeleneta kingdom is likely hiding nearby to coordinate the strike. The king warns Van to be extremely careful as they prepare for a larger assault. Meanwhile, deep within the lush forest just outside the village, Prince Unamog of the Yeleneta kingdom leads a heavily armed vanguard of soldiers. He complains bitterly to his men about being forced to lead an invasion on such a remote, insignificant village, feeling that the menial task is far beneath his prestigious royal status. Unimog confidently boasts to his subordinates that conquering the territory will be an absolute walk in the park and pushes them to move faster. However, as they emerge from the tree line and approach their final destination, the soldiers are completely stunned to find a massive, fully constructed fortress city blocking their path. Unimog refuses to believe that the tiny village could have built real stone ramparts so quickly and angrily insists that the towering walls are just a flimsy facade meant to intimidate them. He aggressively orders his troops to advance and completely destroy the wooden defenses. The armored soldiers rush forward with a massive wooden battering ram and repeatedly strike the heavy wooden gates with all their might. Despite their intense and exhausting efforts, the battering ram barely leaves a scratch on the reinforced doors, leaving the soldiers confused and frustrated by their lack of progress. Suddenly, Van casually calls out a cheerful greeting from the top of the towering stone wall. Unimog and his men look up in absolute shock to see a mere child acting as the lord of the mighty fortress. Van playfully asks what brings them all the way from the Yeleneta kingdom, and Unimog immediately demands to know how he figured out their true origin so easily. Van laughs out loud and admits he was just bluffing, pointing out that Unimog was foolish enough to fall for the trick and confess right away. Humiliated and enraged by the child's taunts, Unimog yells that he will not go easy on a kid and quickly orders his men to signal the mage controlling the wyvern. He plans to bypass the sturdy walls completely by attacking from the sky, fully believing that his flying dragon will easily slaughter the defenders on the ramparts. Up on the wall, Van remains completely unfazed by the threat and decides it is the perfect time to test out his brand new prototype weapon. He gives the signal, and Panamera confidently orders her soldiers to fire the massive, multi-armed ballista mounted on the stone ledge. The weapon launches a custom projectile high into the air, which suddenly detonates into a massive cloud of black smoke right next to the incoming wyvern. The explosion releases a deadly shower of lightweight metal shurikens that effortlessly shred the wyvern mid-flight, sending the massive beast crashing violently to the ground. The resulting shockwave and heavy debris rain down on Unimog and his forces, leaving the prince absolutely terrified and cowering in the dirt. Van happily notes that his makeshift shrapnel bomb was a massive success, while King Dino watches in sheer amazement, realizing that Van's defensive weapons pack enough firepower to rival an elite elemental mage. Unimog spots the King of Scuderia standing on the wall and completely loses his mind, screaming at his men to protect him from the inevitable counterattack. To shut him up and prove a point, Van uses his production magic to instantly drop a massive metal spear from the sky, driving it deep into the cracked earth right between Unimog's legs. The terrifying display of pinpoint power completely breaks Unimog's spirit, leaving him trembling on the ground in total defeat. Later, Unimog is officially captured and tied up in a dark interrogation room. He stubbornly refuses to reveal his kingdom's overall military strategy, but Panamera steps up and presses the sharp blade of her sword directly against his throat. She menacingly asks if he would prefer to have his fingernails ripped out one by one or his eyes brutally gouged out as punishment for his silence. Terrified by her glowing red eye and cruel threats, Unimog instantly breaks down and confesses everything to his captors. He reveals that the Yeleneta kingdom has been carefully planning a massive, multi-pronged invasion for several years. While his vanguard was supposed to easily conquer Van's remote village as a stepping stone, the main enemy force is currently launching a full-scale assault on the supposedly impregnable fortress city of Scudet. Hearing this alarming news, King Dino realizes the extreme severity of the situation and decides he must return to the royal capital immediately to marshal the knights and ride to Scudet's defense before it is too late. During an emergency strategy meeting, the king formally requests that Van join the upcoming military campaign to help protect the borders. However, Van flatly refuses the royal order without hesitation. He passionately explains that his village is only a tenth of the way to becoming the perfect, self-sustaining city he envisions, and he flatly refuses to abandon his people while the territory is still actively developing. Panamera laughs at his stubbornness, while the king gently reminds him that it is the fundamental duty of every noble to answer the call when the entire nation is in absolute peril. Realizing he cannot easily back out of his societal obligations without losing his new title and the peace it brings, Van reluctantly agrees to participate in the dangerous war. However, he sets a strict condition, demanding that he be allowed to organize and lead his own personal troops rather than joining the main army. The king grants his request, and Van quickly gathers his closest allies outside his mansion. He leaves Esparta in charge of managing the village as the acting lord, trusting the older man to keep things running smoothly. Van then recruits Dee and the Cioto Chivalric Order to serve as his main vanguard for the journey. Till, Komsin, and Arte all vehemently insist on joining the dangerous mission, absolutely refusing to let Van face a chaotic battlefield alone. Van worries that showing up with such a tiny group of fighters will make him look weak and unprepared to the other nobles, so he decides to hire some extra muscle for the trip. He tracks down the local adventurers Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala, offering them a highly lucrative escort quest with a massive gold payout for their services. Kusala initially complains heavily about being forced into a brutal war zone, but Van quickly manipulates him by threatening to ban him from the upcoming celebratory barbecue if he refuses to help. Terrified of missing out on the delicious food, Kusala instantly changes his tune and agrees to join the ranks. Panamera also prepares to leave to gather her own forces, promising to meet Van on the battlefield later. Meanwhile, Arte decides to bring her magical marionettes along to help with the heavy lifting during the fights. Before they march out, Van stands before his incredibly diverse, ragtag army of knights, maids, kids, and heavily armed adventurers. He delivers a brutally honest speech, openly stating that they are absolutely not going to fight on the dangerous front lines where the casualties are highest. He declares that his only real goal as their lord is to make sure every single person survives the ordeal without a single scratch. He begs them to cherish their own lives above all else so they can all return home safely and enjoy a massive barbecue together, earning a loud, enthusiastic cheer of approval from the entire group. Far away in the royal capital, Marquis Jalpa, who is Van's estranged father, receives the horrifying news that the fortress city of Skude is under heavy attack by Yeleneta forces. He urgently discusses the crisis with his eldest son, Mercia, and orders the immediate mobilization of their family's knights. When a subordinate mentions that Van recently earned the prestigious title of Baron by developing a village and defeating a dragon, Jalpa completely dismisses the report in anger. He firmly believes that since Van lacks offensive elemental magic, he's entirely useless, assuming the grand rumors of him obliterating a colossal green dragon with a massive yellow energy blast are just exaggerated drivel. Jalpa quickly leads his forces to Skude, but upon arrival, he is met with absolute devastation. The city's supposedly impregnable walls have been thoroughly ruined, and thick black smoke heavily billows into the dark, cloudy sky. Jalpa's knights are immediately ambushed by massive flocks of heavily armored Yeleneta wyverns, and his forces are rapidly wiped out in the brutal, one-sided crossfire. Just as Jalpa braces for total defeat and accepts his fate, the enemy wyverns suddenly break off their relentless attack and rush toward the western gate. Unbeknownst to the Marquis, Van and his Cito chivalric order have just arrived at the west gate to serve as much-needed reinforcements. As soon as the massive wyvern swarm dives toward their position, Arte steps forward and channels her powerful purple magic to protect the group. She completely controls a massive, gray, skull-masked owl marionette called Uno, sending it flying directly into the dense enemy formation. The mechanical beast easily slices through the wyverns with devastating purple energy attacks, shocking the Yeleneta commanders and throwing their aerial assault into total chaos. Van is incredibly proud of Arte's magical prowess and decides to use their flashy entrance to intentionally lure as many enemies toward them as possible, purposefully buying crucial time for the battered Scuderia knights to safely retreat and regroup. Enraged by the sudden interference, the surviving Yeleneta knights charge at Van's group with their swords drawn and murder in their eyes. Kamson confidently steps up with his giant wooden repeating crossbow and unleashes a rapid-fire barrage of heavy arrows, instantly mowing down the frontline chargers before they can even get close. D leads the Sato Knights into the chaotic fray, swinging his massive sword to firmly hold the line against the encroaching soldiers. At the same time, the rowdy adventurers eagerly jump into the bloody chaos to earn their pay. Ortho effortlessly slices through heavily armored soldiers with his massive blade. Pluriel blasts numerous enemies with freezing ice magic from her crystal staff, and Kusala joyfully slices up stragglers with his quick dagger strikes. Even the colorful Mohawk trio casually smashes heavily armed knights to a pulp with their spiked clubs. The skirmish is incredibly one-sided, and Van cheerfully praises everyone for their hard work and dedication. Since they successfully distracted the enemy forces and bought more than enough time for the main army to escape, Van happily orders a full tactical retreat, reminding his team that running away to survive was always their primary objective from the very beginning. Meanwhile, back in a secure location, Marquis Jalpa meets with King Dino, King Gazelle Duargo, and Empress Elmizia to deliver his grim battle report regarding the catastrophic loss. He openly admits that Skude has officially fallen to the enemy and his knights were nearly annihilated in the ambush, explaining that they only survived because the enemy wyverns were mysteriously drawn away by Van's sudden reinforcements. King Dino confirms that Van's remote village has become incredibly powerful, and proudly states that the young boy genuinely earned his noble title through hard work and by actually defeating a dragon. Empress Elmazia smiles warmly through her tears, expressing how deeply proud she is of Van's incredible achievements and rapid growth. Jalpa remains completely stunned and speechless, desperately trying to comprehend how his supposedly useless son managed to accomplish such impossible feats while he suffered a humiliating military defeat. Later that night, Van and his eclectic squad set up a cozy camp deep within a dark, quiet forest safely away from the dangerous front lines. The group gathers around a warm, crackling campfire to rest their bodies after the intense skirmish. Arte looks down at the flickering flames with a sad expression and openly admits that experiencing a real war for the first time was absolutely terrifying, as she deeply hates seeing innocent people getting hurt or killed. Van entirely agrees with her heartfelt sentiments and admits that while they successfully fulfilled their basic noble duty by providing support, leaving Skudet in enemy hands means they will constantly have a massive threat looming near their peaceful village. Since they are allied with Panamera and need to secure their own future safety, Van decides they have no choice but to help retake the fallen city. To accomplish this massive goal without putting his people in direct physical danger, he plans to develop a brand new long-range siege weapon. He closely focuses his unique production magic, and in a massive flash of blue electric light, a gigantic wooden catapult instantly materializes right in the middle of the dark forest clearing. The soldiers and maids stare in absolute awe at the massive, complex piece of artillery that just appeared out of nowhere. Van cheerfully explains that since the local roads are far too damaged to manually transport heavy equipment, he will simply use his magic to mass-produce the weapons right on the active battlefield. He enthusiastically announces his bold plan to build 20 stationary catapults and 5 mobile ones as soon as tomorrow arrives, ensuring they can safely bombard the enemy stronghold from a comfortable distance. With their new strategy firmly set, Van happily calls for a detailed planning meeting, completely determined to launch a massive counterattack and quickly end the war so he can finally go back to enjoying his quiet life. Arte really hates the idea of going into battle, and the hired adventurers like Kusala, Ortho, and Pluriel constantly complain about having to head right back into a dangerous war zone after just escaping one. Van, Till, and Kamson arrive at the bustling city closest to Scudet to see the battered Scuderian army desperately reorganizing their remaining forces. Everyone in the group is still a bit shaken by how incredibly powerful the Yeleneta Kingdom's new Wyvern Riders and explosive black balls were during the previous assault. As they walk through the busy town square filled with heavily armored soldiers, Van unexpectedly runs into his estranged father, Marquis Jalpa. Jalpa notes that it has been a long time and mentions he recently heard the crazy rumors that Van was promoted to a baron for supposedly defeating a forest dragon. Van casually confirms the news and simply explains that he used his custom ballistae to take the massive beast down. Jalpa immediately dismisses the claim as an outright lie, bluntly stating that even he requires his full force of elite knights to handle a monster of that class, making it entirely impossible for a small child to do it alone. Before their argument can escalate any further, Panamera smoothly interrupts the tense father-son reunion. She cheerfully greets Jalpa and then eagerly asks Van if he is willing to sell her some of his newest weapons. Van agrees to prepare some for her soon and promises they can negotiate the exact prices later. Jalpa merely scoffs at his son, acting like a lowly merchant trying to peddle goods. Soon after, Jalpa leads Van and Panamera to a grand building heavily guarded by the king's elite royal guards. Van is deeply impressed by the guards' intense aura, and Panamera jokes that with his advanced equipment, he might actually stand a chance of beating them in a real fight. They enter a grand wood-paneled conference room to begin a crucial strategy meeting with King Dino, Chancellor Aperta, Count Ferdinando, and several other high-ranking nobles. Jalpa officially briefs the council on the dire situation, explaining that Yeleneta easily captured the supposedly impregnable Scudet fortress specifically because of their devastating aerial wyvern attacks and explosive black balls. He stresses that standard battle tactics are completely useless now, and their own reinforcement forces were nearly wiped out by the aerial bombardments. The king asks if anyone has a viable strategy to counter the flying beasts before they can drop their explosives. The older nobles loudly mock the idea as a childish fantasy, insisting that taking down the highly mobile wyverns before they strike is practically impossible. However, the king turns his attention directly to Van and asks if he would be willing to fight on the dangerous front lines to earn glory for the kingdom without a single second of hesitation. Van flatly refuses the royal request and politely asks to be placed in the rear support lines instead, simply because he does not want to get hurt. The room instantly erupts into furious shouting. The nobles are completely outraged by his blatant selfishness, and Jalpa aggressively scolds Van for acting completely out of line and forgetting his lowly place as the ruler of a remote patch of dirt. Van calmly fires back, stating that none of the high-ranking nobles have any idea what it is like to earnestly defend a tiny, vulnerable village entirely from scratch. He explains that he has received absolutely zero financial or military support from his own family, yet he and his citizens have worked tirelessly to develop their home. He warns the council that Yeleneta has already sent reconnaissance forces to probe his territory, meaning they fully intend to conquer all the border domains. If he carelessly dies on the front lines, his small village will be easily burned to the ground. He makes it completely clear that his only priority is protecting the home his people built, so he entirely refuses to take unnecessary physical risks. The king quickly understands Van's pragmatic logic and manages to calm the angry room. One of the nobles mockingly points out that Van speaks as if he actually possesses the power to single-handedly counter the entire Yeleneta army. Van confidently smiles and promises that he can easily handle both the wyverns and the explosive black balls. He offers to heavily support the upcoming siege by mass-producing his new ballistae and catapults to wipe out the aerial threat. The king is highly intrigued by the offer, but Jalpa angrily accuses Van of completely misunderstanding the extreme urgency of a real war, arguing that building heavy siege engines takes weeks of hard labor. To prove his father completely wrong, Van invites everyone outside into the stone courtyard. He casually activates his unique production magic, and in a massive flash of blue light, fully constructed ballistae and heavy wooden catapults instantly materialize out of thin air right on the cobblestones. The nobles and guards completely lose their minds in shock at the impossible sight. Van turns to his father and casually asks for his opinion, but Jalpa stubbornly refuses to admit he is impressed, dismissing the weapons as useless props before violently storming off to reorganize his own troops. The king, however, is deeply impressed by the magical display. Van explains that the catapults are specifically designed to launch custom shrapnel shurikens high into the air to completely shred the wyverns mid-flight. He guarantees that unless the enemy pulls off a miracle, Scuderia has a very strong chance of victory today. The king places his full trust in Van and finally dismisses the council to prepare for the immediate counterattack. After the meeting concludes, Till and Arte arrive to pick Van up. As they walk near the barracks, Arte spots her father, Count Ferdinando, passing by. She nervously approaches him and timidly asks if her mother is doing well. Ferdinando coldly confirms that her mother is fine, but completely brushes Arte off, stating that he is far too busy preparing for a major war to stand around and chat with her. Arte looks incredibly heartbroken and distressed by his blatant dismissal. Van notices her deep sadness and quickly checks on her, assigning Till to stay right by her side and comfort her while the fighting happens. With his personal affairs settled, Van gathers his forces in a dark stone armory to finalize their battle formations. He places Kamsin in complete charge of the heavy artillery squad, trusting the boy to handle the catapults perfectly. D and the Seattle Chivalric Order, along with the hired adventurers, are officially assigned to form a tight defensive perimeter around Kamsin's unit to ensure the artillery remains completely untouched. Panamera points out that since Yelenetta easily conquered Scudet using new technology, the traditional era of battles being decided purely by elemental mages is officially coming to an end. She realizes that Van's mass-produced weapons represent the true future of military supremacy. Soon, the massive Scuderia army officially marches onto the dusty battlefield just outside the towering walls of the captured Scudet fortress. Jalpa passionately rallies the troops, ordering the main infantry to split into two separate forces and charge the ramparts just as they planned. Van and his artillery squad take up their positions safely in the rear, entirely focused on their primary objectives of shooting down the wyverns. Panamera, Kusala, and Plurial form a highly mobile strike unit designed to rapidly support the infantry wherever the lines start to break. D orders his heavily armored Cedo Knights to advance cautiously and form a tight shield wall around the catapults. Up on the towering stone walls, the Yelenetta commander arrogantly watches the Scuderian forces approach. He assumes they plan to slowly chip away at the walls, so he commands his elite archers to unleash a massive volley of silver-tipped arrows to wipe out the vanguard. However, Van heavily anticipated the attack and had already equipped his frontline troops with large, overlapping circular metal shields reinforced with hastily made wooden blocks. The heavy arrow volley harmlessly bounces off the sturdy shield wall, leaving the Yelenetta commander completely stunned. Frustrated, the commander furiously orders his elemental mages to fire a barrage of explosive magical beams directly at the shield formation. The colorful magical blasts rain down from the sky, causing massive explosions that severely rattle the Scuderian defenders. The green-haired commander assumes the shield wall will eventually shatter under the relentless magical pressure. Suddenly, he hears a massive explosion coming from the north gate and realizes Scuderia sent a detached strike force to bypass the main defenses entirely. Down at the gate, Jalpa and Count Ferdinando lead the fierce assault. Combining their immense magical powers, Jalpa unleashes a massive blizzard of ice magic, while Ferdinando fires a concentrated blast of swirling fire. The two opposing elements perfectly merge together into a highly unstable, devastating energy beam that completely obliterates the heavy wooden gate and a large chunk of the surrounding stone wall. The Yelenetta commander is absolutely horrified by the raw, destructive power of the Scuderian high nobles. Van watches the massive explosion from the rear and casually notes that his father and the Count are actually incredibly strong fighters when they put their minds to it. With the main gate entirely breached, Jalpa boldly orders his infantry to charge directly into the city streets. The Scuderian soldiers aggressively flood through the rubble, causing the local civilians to panic and flee in terror as the brutal street fighting officially begins. The Yelenetta commander desperately sends his heavily armored elites to block the narrow choke points. A chaotic, bloody melee quickly erupts as the two armies violently clash. Panamera rapidly leaps into the fray, gracefully dodging enemy strikes and effortlessly slicing through armored soldiers with her dual rapiers. The older militia fighters follow her lead, fiercely clashing swords with the Yeleneta elites. Kusala eagerly jumps into the thickest part of the battle, easily dodging spear thrusts and using his glowing blue dagger to fatally slash the throats of multiple heavily armored enemies in rapid succession. He cockily brags that he will never lose a close-quarters fight. Pluriel supports the vanguard from a distance by rapidly spinning her crystal-top staff, unleashing a massive blizzard of freezing blue magic that instantly decimates a large group of Yeleneta soldiers holding a key intersection. Ortho and his rowdy adventurer friends brutally smash through the remaining defenders using their heavy spiked clubs and massive swords. Seeing his elite ground forces getting completely butchered in the streets, the Yeleneta commander entirely loses his temper and plays his final trump card. He violently signals his hidden troops, and a massive flock of dark wyverns suddenly emerges from the heavy clouds above, carrying riders armed with explosive black balls. The Scuderian soldiers look up in sheer terror as the massive beasts prepare to carpet bomb the entire city. However, Van has been patiently waiting for this exact moment to arrive. He immediately orders Kamsin to open fire. Kamsin loudly commands the artillery unit, and the row of heavy wooden catapults simultaneously launches their black shrapnel projectiles high into the dark sky. The projectiles detonate directly inside the wyvern flock, releasing blinding flashes of light and completely shredding the beast's wings. The wyverns violently crash into the city below, completely neutralizing the deadly aerial threat in a matter of seconds. Van smiles confidently from the rear, fully satisfied that his anti-air strategy worked flawlessly. However, one exceptionally massive gray-furred wyvern manages to survive the barrage and violently crashes into a large stone courtyard. The terrifying beast lets out a deafening roar and violently snaps its sharp beak at the terrified Scuderian soldiers. Refusing to let the monster break their lines, Kusala and Ortho immediately charge at the beast together. They leap high into the air, simultaneously driving their glowing dagger and massive sword directly into the monster's thick skull. While their weapons fail to pierce its heavy bone, the sheer force of their combined strike forcefully pins the beast to the stone floor. Van spots the perfect opening and instantly orders his ballista unit to fire. A heavy barrage of massive bolts slams directly into the pinned monster, finally putting it down for good. With the last of the wyverns entirely eliminated, the Scuderian forces rally and completely overrun the remaining Yeleneta defenders. Panamera loudly cheers, officially declaring that the enemy's main forces have been completely annihilated. The Yeleneta commander finally realizes the battle is entirely lost and desperately attempts to flee the city. However, Kusala and Ortho easily corner him in a dark alleyway, weapons drawn, forcing him to surrender quietly. As the golden sunset completely washes over the bloody battlefield, Jalpa stands on a hill looking out over the conquered fortress. He finally admits to himself that his stubborn beliefs about Van being useless were entirely wrong. Later that evening, Van and his eclectic squad gather inside a grand stone hall within the secured fortress. Van humbly praises everyone for their hard work, insisting that the victory firmly belongs to their bravery rather than his rearguard commands. The adventurers brutally drag the captured Yeleneta commander into the room and throw him onto the floor. Panamera steps forward with a menacing smirk and aggressively interrogates him, demanding to know the full extent of their grand invasion plans. Terrified by her intense aura, the commander quickly breaks down and confesses everything. He reveals that the Yeleneta kingdom's grand strategy was actually a massive three-pronged simultaneous attack. He explains that Seato and Scudet were only the first two targets of the invasion. He then drops a massive bombshell, revealing that the third and final target of their military campaign is Ferdinando County. Hearing this, Arte completely freezes in absolute horror, realizing that the massive enemy army is currently marching directly toward her vulnerable homeland. Hearing that Yeleneta is attacking Ferdinand County, Arte completely panics and immediately begs Van to let her go back to her home. Van flat out refuses to let her go alone and insists on coming with her to fight the war himself. Arte gets stubborn and tells him she cannot keep depending on him because this is strictly a problem for House Ferdinand to solve. Van is deeply worried and points out that she will be walking into an actual war zone. Jalpa and Panamera step in to explain the harsh political reality. They tell Van that if a backwater lord like him goes and saves Count Ferdinand, the Count's reputation will be completely ruined and he will likely lose his territory anyway. Realizing they have no choice but to let her handle it, Van agrees to let her go but insists she take some of his guards with her. Ortho, Kusala, and Pluriel immediately step up and volunteer for the job. They promise Van that they will protect his future wife with their lives and mention that no one will care if a few random adventurers join the fight. Van thanks them and asks them to take good care of Arte. Arte feels incredibly guilty for making everyone worry and apologizes, but she knows she has to save her mother from the invasion. Arte and the adventurers quickly fly on wyverns back to Ferdinand County. When they arrive, they see the town already heavily damaged by explosions from Yelenetta's dark wyverns dropping explosive onyx spheres from the clouds. The Yelenetta army is brutally swarming the streets and destroying the stone buildings. Ortho tells Arte they might be able to turn the tide if they jump into the battle right now and offers to take full command of the unit. Arte refuses his offer, stating that someone from House Ferdinand must be the one to officially drive Yelenetta away. Despite her bold words, she secretly has no idea how she is actually going to fight them off. She suddenly remembers a painful conversation with her mother, Sharon Dora Ferdinand. Her mother once told her to hold back her tears and prepare to fake her own death so she could die an honorable, noble death rather than face the enemy. Meanwhile, the Yelenetta soldiers march triumphantly through the ruined town. Their commander is totally confident that House Ferdinand is no match for them and proudly declares that victory is already in their grasp. Suddenly, a massive silver knight drops out of the sky and starts effortlessly destroying the Yelenetta wyverns mid-flight. The Yelenetta troops panic when they realize all their flying beasts are getting taken out by a single warrior. They look around and spot the large blue flag of House Ferdinand waving on a nearby grassy hill. The commander assumes it is just a small reinforcement base and orders his men to charge the hill and completely wipe them out. On the hill, Arte is trembling with fear, clutching her dress and feeling completely inadequate compared to Van because she lacks his knowledge and battlefield experience. Despite her shaking hands, she gathers her courage and asks Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala to lend her their strength and follow her lead so she can save her home. She boldly declares she will fight right on the front lines. The Silver Knight, which is actually Van's four-armed automaton named Uno, lands right in front of the charging Yelenetta forces and easily knocks them all back with a massive sword swing. Ortho, Kusala, and Pluriel charge into the chaotic fray alongside Uno. Pluriel uses her magic staff with a purple crystal to instantly freeze the legs of the heavily armored Yelenetta knights, allowing Kusala to easily smash them to pieces with his weapons. The Yelenetta soldiers try to fight back, but Uno completely shields Kusala from any counterattacks, even continuing to fight after losing one of its arms. The adventurers ruthlessly clear the cobblestone streets, leaving defeated soldiers scattered everywhere. Just as they think they have the immediate area under control, Pluriel looks up and spots a massive swarm of at least 50 more Yelenetta wyverns darkening the stormy sky. The Yelenetta commander spots Uno on the ground and orders his massive fleet of wyvern riders to destroy the Silver Knight once and for all. Knowing Uno cannot handle them all alone, Arte uses her magic to summon a second automaton wearing purple armor. She starts controlling both of the giant dolls at the exact same time, generating a massive purple and rainbow-colored energy circle that puts an intense strain on her magical reserves. The two automatons launch into the sky and begin slicing through the wyvern swarm. As she controls them, Arte reflects on her painful past. She was born with a natural affinity for marionette magic, but her mother and the rest of the nobles irrationally hated it. The constant rejection and disgust from her own family made her swear to never use her magic in front of anyone again, leaving her feeling completely useless and isolated. However, everything changed when Van took her in. He believed in her, saved her from her own self-doubt, and specifically built these powerful dolls just for her to use. Fueled by her deep desire to protect her loved ones with her magic, Arte pushes her powers to the absolute limit. She commands the automatons to ruthlessly slaughter the wyverns. She targets a massive gray eagle-headed monster wearing a leather collar and easily slices its neck open. The Yelenetta troops on the ground watch in sheer terror as their entire aerial fleet is decimated by a single girl. Realizing they are completely outmatched and that their victory is impossible, the Yelenetta soldiers break formation and flee for their lives. The adventurers cheer loudly in victory as the town is finally secured. Arte approaches her battered automatons on the grassy field and sincerely thanks them for saving her home, knowing she could never have done it without the dolls Van made for her. Inside the Ferdinand castle, Sharon watches the enemy retreat and wonders aloud who just saved their territory. Arte's father, Ferdinando, enters the room and reveals that the Yelenetta army was driven away by two dolls commanded by a young white-haired girl. Sharon instantly realizes it was Arte. She breaks down in tears, overwhelmed with heavy regret, and admits they did their daughter a grave injustice by sending her away when she was the only one who could save them. Out on the hill, Ortho asks Arte if she wants to go down and visit her parents since they are right there in the castle. Arte declines the offer, explaining that her presence would just be a bother since her mother always despised her marionette magic. With her home safe, she decides it is time to go back to Van. Arte returns to Van's thriving town and is warmly greeted by him, Till, and Kamson at the city gates. Despite her massive victory, Arte feels completely downcast. She confesses to Van that she feels like a complete failure because she didn't have the confidence to command the troops as easily as he always does. Van immediately shuts down her negative thoughts. He praises her for doing an amazing job controlling the dolls and tells her she is incredible for saving her entire home. He reminds her of Panamera's words about how much more cheerful she has become since leaving her family. He warmly welcomes her back, and Arte finally breaks into a happy smile, shedding tears of joy as she tells him she is home. Time passes, and Van continues to rapidly expand his town. He uses his production magic to build new shops, local inns, and large modern white buildings with glass balconies, totally transforming the once impoverished remote village into a bustling, wonderful city. Merchants flock to the town in droves, and the rowdy adventurers happily help the elderly citizens around the streets by carrying them on their shoulders. Even the aquatic Apkaloo people, led by Lada Vesta and Lada Priora, integrate perfectly into the community, playing with the cows and enjoying the local food and drinks alongside everyone else. Panamera continues to visit, casually chugging her 10th massive barrel of booze in the town square while the adventurers watch in total awe. Van reflects on his long journey, realizing that even though he was cruelly exiled by his father for his production magic and sent to this remote patch of dirt to die, it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to him. He gathered a merry band of friends, made the village thrive beyond imagination, and found an irreplaceable home. His peaceful thoughts are violently interrupted when Esparta storms out of a building and demands Van start his scholarly studies so he can drill everything into his head. Seconds later, Dee runs up with his massive golden sword, declaring he is going to train Van to be the #1 swordsman in the kingdom. Refusing to do either of those things, Van runs away screaming through the streets. Till, Kamson, Arte, and all the adventurers laugh out loud and cheerfully cheer him on as he desperately sprints away from his crazy mentors. Later, stray Yelenetta forces and packs of green reptilian monsters attempt to attack the town again, but Van easily fends them off using his mass-produced catapults and ballistae, completely obliterating them in seconds. Standing in his colorful town, Van pumps his fists and confidently vows to take things slow and keep working hard to make his territory the most fun place for everyone.